Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
The internet is full of half-truths and all-out lies. We've all seen them, and many people on social media complaining about it. Here's your chance to show and prove. WorldAfropedia.com is a black-owned and operated encyclopedia. There are several thousand articles, but we need help. We can't uncover all the truth ourselves. So please, join us and become a writer, editor, or blogger for WorldAfropedia.com today. Every little bit counts. We owe it to the future generations to put the truth out there. Visit WorldAfropedia.com, the African-centered encyclopedia, a global database of African knowledge for the purpose of bringing about global African wisdom and understanding. WorldAfropedia.com.
Western culture has acquired over the last 200 years a couple of metaphorical ways to think about people whose bodies are controlled and forced to work against their own control and interests. One is the zombie. Now, this word entered U.S. culture on a large scale after U.S. Marines occupied Haiti in 1915, and it's gone on to become a staple of horror movies and literature. But the concept in Haiti, at any rate, was really, I would argue, a commentary on the history of slavery. Supposedly, some Haitian Vodun practitioners can use spells and potions to kill a person and then raise them up as a will-less body that moves and acts but isn't really alive anymore. And I would say that on one level, this zombie story is really a myth about slavery, which of course the Haitian people also endured. A system in which powerful white wizards created rituals of social death, as the anthropologist Orlando Patterson memorably put it, describing the ways slaves could be separated from their people and their own control over their own bodies. And likewise, we can see how forced migrants to the cotton frontier like Charles Ball, though they were already enslaved when they were bought by slave traders, were pushed through rituals of social death, like separation from family and sale. And we can see how they could feel in the cotton fields. They might be moving, but they were no longer truly alive. Well, U.S. pop culture zombies, what U.S. pop culture has done with the zombie myth, actually looks to me more like a replay of slave revolt horror stories, the kind that grip 19th century white America with anxiety from time to time. And those faithful servants suddenly turned into murderous, irrational rapists, just like American zombies are well known to do. But maybe it's no accident that the zombie trope in U.S. popular culture took off in the mid-1960s as images of black power and urban riots occupied white America's television screens. But that's a digression. In the 19th century, the zombie body that African America was in danger of becoming as cotton slavery expanded was more like the classical Haitian formulation. By the time Charles Ball, separated from the family and the hope for freedom and the pride in his own labor that had made even a life in Maryland slavery worthwhile, was toiling down one cotton row after another, all day long, becoming the equivalent of a zombie was a real possibility for him. And not just for him, but for all African Americans who endured this. As the power of enslavers grew, so too did their ability to render not just individuals, but a whole Gulliver body of African America dead in spirit, its components dead to one another, enslaved forever in a body that served their captors.
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, December 18th, 2015, so I have been told. The audio segment at the beginning, that was Edward Baptist, racist suspect, having a discussion, C-SPAN, Book TV. This is from 2014. And he was talking about the usage of the term zombie, some of the history of that term, and how it relates to his book and the system of white supremacy. I thought that would be interesting, given our recent conversation with Mr. Tariq Nasheed about The Walking Dead and the subject of zombies. At any rate, Mr. Baptist, his book, The Half Has Never Been Told. This is our second audio study session. We are picking up in Chapter 1. For me, it is on page 84. For me, there's a photograph of a cotton gin, and we're picking up right below it. I know it might not correspond exactly for people who'd have different versions of the text, but that's kind of an approximation based on the book that I have. Without further delay, we will get started. I would encourage folks to kind of keep in mind the metaphor, both what you heard about the metaphor in the audio segment, because that's in the text as well, and also just the overall metaphor of focusing on body parts and using that as a method to show the detail, to make it visceral. The war against black people, the war against the black body, just how is that working? How is that manifest as we move through the text? We will go ahead and get started. Context of White Supremacy. Again, this is The Half Has Never Been Told, audio segment number 1.
There were two chief Yazoo schemes. The first was launched in 1789, when it began to seem likely that Georgia would surrender the land south of Tennessee to the federal government. Indeed, the ratification of the U.S. Constitution and North Carolina's relinquishment of Tennessee to the federal government made this step seem imminent. To establish a claim to as much of this land as possible, financiers put together 3 investment companies: the South Carolina Yazoo Company, the Tennessee Yazoo Company, and the Virginia Yazoo Company. The last was headed, on paper, by revolutionary firebrand Patrick Henry. Each was, boosters claimed, a company of most respectable gentlemen, whose endeavors would open up a vast and opulent territory for the honor of the United States. The companies struck a deal with the legislature of Georgia, acquiring 16 million acres for $200,000, 12.5 cents an acre. And what a land it was rumored to be. Boosters claimed that it could produce all the plantation crops a North American reader could wish for in 1789. Indigo, rice, and sugarcane grew luxuriantly in the Yazoo of the mind. 2 crops a year. The most fertile soil in the world. A climate like that of classical Greece. Land buyers would flock there. And, supposing each person only to purchase 1 Negro, wrote one Charleston, as he called himself in a Philadelphia newspaper, this would eventually create an immense opening for the African trade. Charleston suggested that each planter of tobacco and indigo could trade slave-made crops for more slaves. After buying 1 Negro, the next year he could buy 2, and so be increasing on. In 1789, investors' expectations already marked off the Yazoo for slavery, and investors attracted by Yazoo expectations counted on slavery's wealth-generating capacity to yoke together the interests of many parties across regional boundaries. People from the free states who might dislike the political ramifications of the 3/5 Compromise had few qualms about pumping investment into a slave country. They expected to make money back with interest from land speculation, from financing and transporting slaves, and from the sale of commodities. Investors nationwide bought the bonds of these land companies and put their securities into circulation like paper money. The 1789 Yazoo sale eventually collapsed, but within 6 years, the Georgia legislators found a second set of pigeons. Or perhaps it was the Georgia power brokers who were the ones conned. Or yet again, maybe the citizens of Georgia were being fleeced. In 1795, the Spanish government signed the Treaty of San Lorenzo, surrendering its claim to the Yazoo lands. A newly formed company, the Georgia-Mississippi Land Company, moved quickly to make a new deal. The roster of the company's leaders included a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, a territorial governor, 2 congressmen, 2 senators, Robert Morris of Pennsylvania and James Gunn of Georgia, and Wade Hampton of South Carolina, who was on his way to becoming the richest man in the country. Since the federal government would surely soon extinguish Georgia's western claims, speculators then would be dealing with a legislature that would be more expensive to bribe than a state. So the company sent Senator Gunn swooping down on Augusta, the Georgia state capital, with satchels of cash. Within days, Gunn persuaded the legislature to sell 35 million acres of land between the Chattahoochee and the Mississippi rivers for $500,000 in gold and silver. The Georgia-Mississippi Land Company immediately sold the titles to other speculative entities, especially the Boston-based New England Mississippi Land Company. That company, well provided with venture capital, broke up land into smaller parcels, which it then sold in the form of paper shares to investors. These Yazoo securities created a massive scramble in Boston, driving up the price of stock in the New England Mississippi Land Company and creating paper fortunes. But in Georgia, people were furious. James Jackson, Gunn's fellow senator and political rival, pronounced the entire operation a fraud. Although he was a notorious land speculator in his own right, Jackson organized resentment of the Yazoo sale into a tidal wave of the next state legislative elections. In 1796, new representatives passed a statute overturning the previous legislature's land grant. They literally expunged by fire the record of sale from the 1795 session book of the legislature. The legal consequences of the sale itself remained unsettled. What was clear, however, was that people around the United States were willing to pour money onto slavery's frontier. They anticipated that slave-made commodities would find a profitable market. So did migrant enslavers, and so they demanded more slaves. In 1786, John Lawson wrote to a Virginia planter whose Georgia land he managed. Crops were fine, he reported. Impending war with the Indians promised more land acquisitions, and likely Negroes is the best trade for land that can be. Indeed, access to the large supplies of surplus slaves from the Chesapeake was the best form of currency for buying land that one could possess. To get land in Wilkes County, Georgia, Virginian Edward Butler traded the promise of 3 likely young Negroes who were still in Virginia. The buyer wished, Butler reminded himself in his diary, one of the said 3 Negroes to be a girl or young wench. Back in Virginia, Butler hired Thomas Wooten to transport 13 more enslaved people down to Georgia. Wooten delivered 3 likely young Negroes to their purchaser and settled the rest on Butler's thus purchased land. In this kind of process, less wealthy white men, such as Wooten, perceived a growing opportunity for those who were willing to buy slaves in the Chesapeake and march them south for sale. Such white men began to strike out on their own in greater numbers with each year in the 1780s and 1790s. So, the Georgia man, an all too real boogeyman, became a specific type of danger in the oral book of knowledge of enslaved African Americans. Thus, as he sat mute and bound in the bow of a rowboat that had been hired to take him across the Patuxent River from Ballard's Landing, Charles Ball already knew his fate. The way enslaved African Americans talked about Georgia and Georgia men was their way of describing the new economic, social, and political realities that were destroying the world they had built in the Chesapeake. Yet 20 years of fearing the Georgia men did not make the instantaneous demolition of his family and future any easier. And while he had always feared the slave trade, Ball was beginning to realize that the Georgia man who faced him across the body of the sweating oarsman was building a machine even more cunning than he had imagined. Now, as they neared the other side, Ball saw a group of African Americans huddled on the bank. They were his 51 fellow captives. 19 women were linked together by a rope tied to the cord halters that encircled their necks. 32 men were in a different situation, and Ball was about to be joined to them. A blacksmith waited with iron for him, iron collar, manacles, chains. The buyer cut loose the tight cords around Ball's wrists. Ball stood, indifferent to his fate, as he later remembered, while the 2 white men fitted the collar on his neck and slid the hasp of an open brass padlock through a latch in the front. Then they passed a heavy chain inside of the curve of metal and pushed the hasp and the body of the padlock together. Click. The same heavy iron stringer now joined Ball to the other 32 men, sliding like fish strung through the gills. Then, for the last step in the process, the blacksmith took 2 bands of iron, put them around Ball's wrists, and pounded down bolts to fasten the manacles. He attached the manacle on Ball's right wrist by a short chain to the left manacle of the next man on the neck chain. The two of them would have to walk in step and next to each other. Ball was now becoming one moving part of something called a coffle, an African term derived from the Arabic word kafala, a chained slave caravan. The hammer pounded hard, and the bolt pinched the wrist of Bale's chainmate, who began to cry. Ball sat stoically, but on the inside, his emotions ran just as wild. His mind raced uncontrolled, from the suffering that awaited him in a place that he believed had long since killed his mother, to even more despairing internal sentences. I wish I had never been born. I want to die. I cannot even kill myself because of these chains. They waited on the bank. The blacksmith yawned. By the time a flat-bottomed boat approached the bank, Ball's heart had stopped racing. I concluded, he said as an old man, telescoping a recovery in reality more painfully won, that as things could not become worse, and as the life of man is but a continued round of changes, they must, of necessity, take a turn in my favor at some future day. I found relief in this vague and indefinite hope. In the boat was the returning Georgia man, who ordered them all on board. The women, Ball now noticed that a couple of them were obviously pregnant, and the 16 pairs of men, plus one, clambered in with a chorus of clinking. The scow set off toward the south bank of the Patuxent. The slave rowers pulled. Probably they didn't sing this song that one white traveler heard Chesapeake watermen chanting. Going away to Georgia, ho, heave, oh. Massa sell poor Negro, ho, heave, oh. Leave poor wife and children, ho, heave, oh. A man or woman who discovered that he was being taken south might be desperate enough to do anything. Some ran. Some fought like tigers. William Grimes tried to break his own leg with an axe. No wonder sellers and buyers schemed to take men like Charles Ball unawares. And once buyers bought, no wonder they bolted fetters on men and ran links of iron through padlocks. Men could march together carrying their chains, but there was no way they could all run together. There was no way they could leap off a boat and swim to shore. No way 33 men hauling 1,000 pounds of iron could hide silent in the woods. The coffle chains enabled Georgia men to turn feet against hearts, to make enslaved people work directly against their own love of self, children, spouses, of the world, of freedom and hope. When the scow scraped bottom in the shallows on the other side of the river, and the people awkwardly staggered out, the Georgia man led them up the bank and onto a road that they walked until evening fell, heading southwest. They stopped at a rough tavern. The proprietor put them in one large room. 52 pairs of mostly manacled hands managed to share a large pot of cornmeal mush before it was too dark to see. That night, Ball, nestled between the two men chained closest to him, lay awake for many hours. When at last he slept, his son came to him. In Ball's dream, the little boy tried to break the chain between his father's manacles to set his father's hands free, so that he could fix the boy's broken world. But the iron held. Charles' son faded. Then Charles' grandfather appeared. Born in Africa in the 1720s, he'd been kidnapped as a teenager and sold to men who brought him across the salt water to Maryland. There they renamed him, and by the time Charles had known him, Old Ben was gray with half a century in slavery. Ben never surrendered his own version of Islam, or his contempt for either the enslavers or the enslaved people who behaved submissively. Charles's father, in contrast, had tried to play a less defiant part. But after the 1785 sale of his wife and children, the father changed. He spent his free time at Old Ben's hut, talking about Africa and the wrongs of slavery. The owner grew worried that the younger man would run away. He arranged a posse to help seize Charles's father for a Georgia trader, but Old Ben overheard two white men talking about the plan. He crossed 3 miles of woods in the dark to Charles's father's cabin. Handing his son a bag of dried corn and a jug of cider, Ben sent him off toward Pennsylvania. No one in Calvert County ever heard from Charles's father again. Ben would have come for his grandson too, but the old man was dead 10 years gone, and these locks and chains would have defeated even his survivor's cunning. When the sun came up, it found Ball stumbling forward, trying to keep time with the rest of the coffle. In the days to come, Ball and the other men gigged on the Georgia man's line marched steadily southwest, covering 10 to 20 miles a day. The pregnant women complained desperately. The Georgia man rode on. After crossing the Potomac, he moved Ball, who was physically the strongest of the men, from the middle of the chain and attached his padlock collar to the first iron link. With Ball setting a faster pace, the two sets of double lines of people hurried down the high road, a dirt line in the Virginia grain fields that today lies under the track of U.S. Highway 301. Ball's emotions continued to oscillate, yet slowly he brought his interior more in line with the exterior face that men in coffles tried to wear. Time did not reconcile me to my chains, Ball recalled, but it made me familiar with them. Familiar indeed. At night, as everyone else slept, Ball crawled among his fellow prisoners, handling each link, looking for the weak one. He found nothing. But sometimes slave traders were careless, like the ones who were taking Jack Neal down the Ohio River in 1801. They had shackled him to the side of the boat, but one night Neal worked loose the staple that fastened iron chain to wood. He crept along the deck to his sleeping captor, slipped the white man's loaded pistol from his pocket, and blew the man's brains out. Neal then went to the far end of the boat, where another white man was steering, and announced, "Damn you! It was your time once, but it is mine now." Neal was recaptured on the Ohio shore and executed. Others had already tried the same thing, such as the enslaved men who in autumn 1799 killed a Georgia man named Spears in North Carolina. He'd spent $9,000 buying people in Northern Virginia, money embezzled from the Georgia State Treasury by a legislator, as it turned out. If Spears had brought the men all the way to the end of the trail and sold them, perhaps the money could have been replaced, and no one would have been the wiser. But he forgot to close a lock one night, and as a newspaper reported, the Negroes rose and cut the throat of Mr. Spears and of another man who accompanied him. 10 slaves were killed in the course of local authorities' attempts to recapture them. Every enslaved prisoner wanted to rise at one point or another. Properly closed locks disabled that option. Cuffs bound hands, preventing attack or defense. Chains on men also made it harder for women to resist. Isolated from male allies, individual women were vulnerable. One night at a tavern in Virginia's Greenbrier County, a traveler watched as a group of traders put a coffle of people in one room. Then, wrote the traveler, each white man took a female from the drove to lodge with him, as is the common practice. 10-year-old enslaved migrant John Brown saw slave trader Starling Finney and his assistants gang rape a young woman in a wagon by a South Carolina road. The other women wept. The chained men sat silently. Chains enabled another kind of violence to be done as well. Chains saved whites from worrying about placating this one's mother or buying that one's child. Once the enslaved men were in the coffle, they weren't getting away unless they found a broken link. For 500 miles, no one had to call names at night to ensure they hadn't run away. Men of the chain couldn't act as individuals, nor could they act as a collective, except by moving forward in one direction. Even this took some learning. Stumble, and one dragged someone else lurching down by the padlock dangling from his throat. Many bruised legs and bruised tempers later, they would become one long file, moving at the same speed, the same rhythm, no longer swinging linked hands in the wrong direction. Of course, though they became a unit, they were not completely united. Relationships between the enslaved could play out as conflict or alliance, or both. People were angry, depressed, despairing, sick of each other's smell and the noises they made, how they walked too fast or slow, how no one could even piss or shit by themselves. At night, lying too close, raw wrists and sore feet aching, men in chains or women in ropes argued, pushed, tried to enforce their wills. John Parker, chained in the coffle as a preteen, remembered a weaker boy named Jeff who was bullied until John came to his aid, helping him stand up against a big teenager who was taking food from the younger children. None of that mattered to the Georgia man as long as the chain kept moving, and Ball led the file down through Virginia into North Carolina at a steady pace. As the days wore on, the men, who were never out of the chains, grew dirtier and dirtier. Lice hopped from scalp to scalp at night. Black and red lines of scabs bordered the manacles. No matter. The Georgia man would let the people clean themselves before they got to market. In the meantime, the men were the propellant for the coffle chain, which was more than a tool, more than mere metal. It was a machine. Its iron links and bands forced the black people inside them to do exactly what entrepreneurial enslavers and investors far distant from slavery's frontier needed them to do in order to turn a $300 Maryland or Virginia purchase into a $600 Georgia sale. At some point after they crossed the Potomac, Ball decided that as long as he was in the coffle, he could only do two things. The first was to carry the chain forward like a pair of obedient, disembodied feet. That, of course, benefited the Georgia man and a whole array of slave sellers, slave buyers, and financiers of the trade, while carrying him further from home and family, and he had to do it, whether he wanted to or not. The second thing, unlike the first, was something he could choose whether to do or not do. Charles decided to learn about his path, because understanding the path might eventually be for his own benefit. So he carefully watched the dirt roads of Virginia and North Carolina pass beneath his feet. He whispered the names of rivers as he lay in irons at night. He noted how far the cornfields had gone toward making ears as May crawled toward June. And he tried to draw out the grim man who sat on the horse clopping beside the line. Day after day, Ball emitted a stream of exploratory chatter at the Georgia man's ears, blathering on about Maryland customs, growing tobacco, and his time in the Navy Yard. Enslaved people trained themselves all their lives in the art of discovering information from white people. But Ball couldn't pry loose even the name of the man who played this role of Georgia man. The role already did not have the best reputation among white folks in Virginia and Maryland. Some resented the way coffles, driven right through town, put the most unpleasant parts of slavery right in their faces. Others resented the embarrassment the traders could inflict. In the 1800 presidential election, Thomas Jefferson defeated the incumbent, John Adams, and the federal government shifted to the District of Columbia, and so the heart of the United States moved to the Chesapeake. Clanking chains in the capital of a republic founded on the inalienable right to liberty became an embarrassment, in particular, to Virginia's political leaders. Northern Federalist newspapers complained that Jefferson had been elected on the strength of electoral votes generated by the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, claiming, in other words, that Virginia's power came not from championing liberty, but from enslaving human beings. Sometimes both Georgia men and the enslaved intentionally irritated that particular sting. A few years after Ball was herded south, a slave trader marched a coffle past the U.S. Capitol just as a gaggle of congressmen took a cigar break on the front steps. One of the captive men raised his manacles and mockingly sang, "Hail Columbia," a popular patriotic song. Another such occasion relied for its emotional punch not on the sarcasm of captives, but on the brashness of captors. Jesse Torrey, a Philadelphia physician, was visiting the Capitol when he saw a coffle pass by in chains. A passerby explained that the white drivers of the caravan were Georgie men. The doctor walked up to one and inquired, in what must have been an accusatory tone, "Have you not enough such people in that country yet?" "Not quite yet," was the sneering reply. Another incident even became something of a media scandal. In the early 19th century, Americans were redefining the role of women, arguing that mothers needed to teach their sons the principles of self-sacrifice if young men were to grow up to be virtuous citizens of the young republic. In December 1815, an enslaved woman named Anna dramatized the way in which slavery's expansion did not allow her to do that. Sold to a Georgia man, separated from her husband and all but 2 of her children, She had been locked in a third-floor room at George Miller's Tavern on F Street in Washington, D.C. Squeezing through a garret window, she was either trying to escape or jumping from despair. Whichever it was, gravity took over, and Anna fell 25 feet, breaking her spine in both arms. Dragged into a bed, she said before dying, "I am sorry now that I did it. They have carried my children off with them to Carolina." Jefferson and his allies wanted to neutralize discussion of slavery. With the help of Northerners, they were eventually able to do just that. Jefferson and his allies had fought their Federalist opponents over many things in the 1790s. The French Revolution, the Federalists' perceived desire to centralize power in the federal government, whether political opposition to the president was treason. But they almost never fought over slavery. During the 1800 election, a few Northern Federalists charged Jefferson with keeping a harem of enslaved lovers at Monticello. But Southern Federalists, and most Northern ones, kept the slavery question sheathed. They did so because of interest. Slavery's expansion was one topic in which political leaders from all sides could find common interest. In Congress, prominent Southern Federalists, led by Robert Goodloe Harper of South Carolina, blocked Georgia's 1796 attempt to repeal the Yazoo sale. Together with Northern advocates for financial capital, such as Jefferson's nemesis Alexander Hamilton, Harper insisted that a contract was a contract and a sale was final. Both investors and the cause of developing the southwestern United States should be protected from a legislature elected by popular demagoguery and out to overturn a legal transaction. The debate over the Yazoo claims might seem straightforward. Big money versus small farmers meant Federalists versus Jeffersonians, nationalists versus states' writers. Yet, things were not so simple. Many Northern Republicans had invested in Yazoo bonds. Many Georgians recognized how they could benefit if the sale stood. And there was a potential quid pro quo on the table. In 1798, Congress was debating whether to organize the Mississippi Territory, the land sold off by the Georgia legislature in 1795. Several Northern Federalists attempted to add the Northwest Ordinance's Article 6 to the bill, proposing to outlaw slavery in a land where it already existed, especially around Natchez. Although the territory would obviously become at least one Jefferson-leaning state, Federalist Robert Goodloe Harper gathered an interregional coalition of both Federalists and Republicans to defeat the amendment. These were not only Southerners, but also Northerners who knew that trying to ban slavery could jeopardize Georgia's surrender of land claims to the federal government. That would delay the survey and sale of land, and thus the time when Yazoo investors could recoup their investments. And the investors knew that these millions of acres would yield much more value if purchasers could count on setting slaves to labor on them. Many congressmen examined their direct financial interests and chose to ensure that Mississippi became a slave territory. To soothe their consciences, some of Jefferson's followers began to claim that expanding slavery would actually make it more likely that slavery could eventually be eliminated. If the slaves of Southern states were permitted to go into this Western country, argued Virginia Congressman William Branch Giles, by lessening the number in those older states and spreading them over a large surface of country, there would be a greater probability of ameliorating their condition, which could never be done whilst they were crowded together as they now are in the Southern states. If the slaves were diffused, enslavers would be more likely to free them, for whites were afraid to live surrounded by large numbers of free black people. Thus, moving enslaved people into new regions where their enslavement was more profitable would lead to freedom for said enslaved people, making slavery bigger in order to make it smaller, spread it out to contain its effects. And those most eager to buy this bogus claim were the Virginians themselves. Jefferson became the most prominent advocate of diffusion. The notion provided a layer of deniability for liberal enslavers who were troubled by slavery's ability to undermine their self-congratulation. Diffusion answered the clanking figures who sang "Hail Columbia" and the knowing sneer of the Georgia man who knew the price of every soul. In 1798, Georgia ceded its lands to the federal government, and Congress organized the land between the Chattahoochee and the Mississippi rivers into the Mississippi Territory, with slavery included. Congress proved unable to decide whether the Yazoo claimants had a right to the land bought in 1795. In the House debate, Virginia Federalist John Marshall was one of the claimants' most vigorous promoters. Long an advocate for investors who speculated on southwestern lands, Marshall would soon be appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by President Adams. Once Jefferson was elected, he tried to settle the troubled waters of the political nation by proclaiming in his 1801 inaugural address, "We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans." He might as well have argued, "We are all diffusionists, we are all Yazoo speculators." And then he could have added reassuringly, "We are none of us Georgia men." Yet, in 1805, the man on the horse directed Charles Ball and his coffle around Richmond, Virginia's capital. Perhaps he did so to spare the eyes and the consciences of those who weren't fully persuaded by diffusionism's sloppy logic. But Georgia men didn't have to explain themselves to the likes of Charles Ball, or to anyone, so long as the enslavers were willing to supply a stream of men and women to the backcountry. And the existence of Georgia men allowed those who reacted to the ugliness of diffusion in actual practice to waste their heat on an enemy who didn't care what they said. So, Ball and the coffle crossed the river on a ferry west of the city. The two lines, men in chains and women in ropes, walked southwest from Richmond for weeks. One day in southern Virginia, they passed a road leading up to a low house surrounded by sandy tobacco fields. 100 men, women, and children toiled out there under the gaze of a white man with a long whip. The Georgia man stopped another white man coming up the road. "Whose land is that?" he asked. "Mr. Randolph, a member of Congress." The coffle kept on. They crossed the Roanoke River, entering North Carolina's Piedmont. Next came a week of hard marching through this land of small farms, passing cornfields and the boys and girls toiling in them. Then water was sloshing around Ball's feet on the deck of an overloaded flat as a Yadkin River ferryman pulled on the rope. One trip for the men, going back for the women. 3 days marching later, and the Georgia man told them they had entered South Carolina, a place name that was part of the greater Georgia in Ball's geography. Night fell. Thoughts of death returned. In the morning, just to make sure they had all understood that they had marched into a different part of the world, the Georgia man pried open his compressed lips and made a little speech. They were now too far from Virginia or Maryland to ever get back again, he told them. They must give up all hope of returning. And there was much truth to what the Georgia man said. These 52 enslaved African Americans had now walked into a place that the coffle chain had inked onto the map with streaks of iron oxide from sweat and dirty manacles. Beside the road, they began to see a strange crop growing in the early summer fields. It looked not unlike buckwheat before it blossoms, Ball remembered. This was the cotton plant. In this place where chains marched past plants that looked like food but turned into fiber, they were trapped in a deeper slavery, one shifted into being by 2 decades of Georgia men traveling to and from the Chesapeake. When the American Revolution had ended, 20,000 enslaved people had lived in the South Carolina backcountry. Now, 75,000 were there. Meanwhile, the Georgia slave population was growing too, increasing from 30,000 in 1790 to 107,000 in 1810. The next day, as they walked, a stranger rode up, matching the Georgia man's pace. "Niggers for sale?" He wanted to buy 2 women. The 2 men negotiated, argued, and insulted each other a little. The new man stared at the women and told them what he thought he'd do with them. The coffle kept moving. The white men rode along, bargaining. Maybe the deal could be sweetened, allowed the Georgia man, if the South Carolinian paid to have the chains knocked off the men. $1,000 for the 2, plus blacksmith fees. They stopped at a forge, and they kept arguing. The new man stated for everyone's benefit that he had worked African men to death in iron collars. The blacksmith came out and asked what the 2 gentlemen were making such a frolic about. Ball later said, "Frolicking? Down there, Ball realized, the Carolinians' play, the time when they were most fully themselves, was evidently when they were arguing, negotiating, dealing, and intimidating the enslaved. For $2.50, the blacksmith would take off the chains. As he knocked off the bolts and the Georgia man unkeyed the locks, the South Carolina buyer took the two women away. One was a Calvert woman, the mother of 4. Ball had known her most of his life. He hoped he wouldn't end up with a man as frightening as the one who had taken her. Freed of the heavy iron, Ball was giddy, but not happy. 5 weeks in the chains had changed him just as surely as it had changed his location on the map. The enslaved people toiling in the fields kept their heads down as the new feet from Maryland walked past. He could see that more power hung over them, and now him too. White people now treated Ball as a different kind of property. Under Virginia and Maryland law, the slave had been chattel since the 17th century. Slaves could be sold by their owners, moved by their owners, and separated from others by their owners. Georgia and Carolina cut and pasted many aspects of the Virginia slave code into their laws, but in practice, the laws were implemented differently. Almost all of the slaves down here were new to the whites who owned them, and they used them without constraint. The Chesapeake enslavers were bound by many different considerations when it came to buying or selling human beings. Family ties between enslaved people that were important to other whites, fear of angry slaves, fear of one's evangelized conscience, fear of foreign criticism of the land of the free. Still, by 1805, the coffle chain was breaking that pattern, even back in Virginia. Up and down the path that ran from east to west, north to south, the chain made a person's feet work against him or her. The person in irons became more truly owned by someone else, more easily separated from family, and more easily traded and commodified. The coffle helped make Ball's enslavement deeper and more flexible. It linked his marching feet to the needs of the nation's most successful people. It provided defenses for those who did not want to deal with their own half-hearted moral failure, with the inclusion of slavery in new state constitutions. The existence of the Georgia man and the Yazoo as options also made a chained ball into a movable piece in the political economic puzzle of the young United States. For although coffles got no closer than Pennsylvania Avenue to the room in which John Marshall read out his 1810 decision in Fletcher v. Peck, their chained footprints walked all over the case file. The technical issue before the court was whether the Georgia state legislature could overturn a contract of sale into which a previous session had entered. Marshall and the court ruled that the people of Georgia could not overturn the sale. The contract might have been accomplished by bribery. It may have contravened the will of the majority of white Georgians. But the sale to the investors' land companies was a sale of property all the same, and property rights, by the Chief Justice's interpretation of the contract clause of the Constitution, were absolute. The people who invested in the company, mostly New England money market types and bankers, should be repaid from the sale of the land, which was now held by the federal government. Federalists were happy, but so were many of Jefferson's party. In Massachusetts, in New York City, and in Philadelphia were large nests of Jeffersonians whose financial fortunes were as invested in the development of stock and bond markets as those of their local Federalist rivals. Congress now had to compensate the Yazoo bondholders. The payout to speculators who had bought up the bonds would in turn strengthen confidence in all American capital markets. The court was providing security that would bring more money into the southwestern territories over time. Some Southern Jeffersonians felt betrayed by the court's Republican appointees. Georgia politicians were furious in public. Tellingly, though, neither Jefferson nor his protege, President James Madison, had attempted to influence the outcome of the Yazoo situation in favor of Georgia's desire to overturn the earlier legislature's sale of half of Alabama and Mississippi. The principle that a contract is inviolable and that property is absolute was now the accepted conclusion of the federal Constitution. In the Fletcher decision, the Chief Justice never mentioned slavery, but the court's decision made possible the survey and sale of more than 20 million acres for slavery's expanding footprint. Marshall's ruling also gave every future defender of slavery and its expansion an incredible tool. Consider this. If the people of Georgia couldn't overturn a contract born from obvious corruption, how could a legislature or any other government entity take slaves away from owners? Enslaved African Americans were property acquired by contract, according to the law of slave states. Nor, the decision implied, could legislatures constrain enslavers' right to treat said property as being as absolute, as mobile, and as alienable as they liked. The interlinked expansion of both slavery and financial capitalism was now the driving force in an emerging national economic system that benefited elites and others up and down the Atlantic coast, as well as throughout the backcountry. From Jefferson and Madison's perspective, the soon-to-be states of the Mississippi Territory would yield votes in the Electoral College and Congress, votes to use against the Federalists, and more than they would have gained by courting hardcore states' writers. One of the latter was Jefferson's one-time lieutenant, the increasingly erratic Yazoo hater John Randolph, whose whip-wielding overseer had seemed to Charles Ball like an omen of the Georgia looming up at the end of his road. Instead, the Republicans now formed a pro-finance, pro-expansion coalition that ingested many one-time Federalists and dominated U.S. politics until, by the 1820s, it became a victim of its own success. Randolph was one of the few Southern enslavers consistent enough to insist that both the stigmatization of Georgia men and the diffusion scam were hypocrisies. That kind of truth-telling drives an implicated man mad, and Randolph, once Speaker of the House, eventually spiraled into a level of insanity remarkable for even a Virginia politician. More typically hypocritical was Bushrod Washington, Georgia's nephew and a Supreme Court justice. This classic Virginia gentleman, who inherited Mount Vernon in 1799 when his uncle died, had concurred with Marshall in 1810. Perhaps he had done so because of the sweet reasonableness of the Chief Justice's arguments. More likely, the principle of property and contract offered men like Washington a series of untrumpable outs. Such justifications came in handy in 1821, for instance, when it became public knowledge that Washington had sold 54 people from Mount Vernon to a slave trader, who had then taken them through the Yazoo territories. In response to a newspaper editor who complained that the father of our country's nephew had sold human beings like horned cattle, Bushrod Washington wrote, "On my own behalf, and on that of my Southern fellow citizens to enter a solemn protest against the propriety of any person questioning our right, legal or moral, to dispose of property which is secure to us by sanctions equally valid with those by which we hold every other species of property." Men like Washington the Younger could use the property story underlined by Fletcher versus Peck to slip away from confronting the contradictions of slavery's expansion, even if singing coffles and snickering Georgia men waved the contradictions under Congress's collective nose. Having said of himself in 1788 that nobody will be more willing to encounter every sacrifice to bring about emancipation, in 1814 Jefferson ruefully shook his head and said that the old generation had moved too slowly. Now, instead of finding that the generous temperament of youth raised the new generation above the suggestions of avarice, he realized that the young men of this new day dawning had digested the lessons of Georgia and were racing to create fortunes from slavery's expansion. Bushrod Washington also got good mileage from Jefferson's diffusion story. His decision to sell off enslaved people was, he insisted, not a tale of greed, but a demonstration of how forced migration protected white lives. As the African Americans living at Mount Vernon grew in number, he claimed, they had become insubordinate. A couple of Washington's slaves escaped to the north, using their feet to undermine his right to property. The rest came to believe that when he died they would be free. And the justice began to fear that they were speculating about where the sharpest knives were, and how they might hide poison in his food. No more Bushrod, no more slavery. Jefferson had blurted analogous fears, famously speaking of a possible reversal of fortunes, and describing the situation of Chesapeake slaveholders as being like riding a wolf held by the ears. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Even if whites had agreed to general emancipation, whites had deeply rooted prejudices, and blacks 10,000 recollections. New provocations would divide and whip them into an apocalyptic race war crescendo. These convulsions would end only with extermination of the one or the other race. So Jefferson and Washington and other white Virginians stuck to a third choice, a financially profitable one: to diffuse enslaved African Americans south and west. And the existence of the Georgia men allowed such respectable leaders to draw alleged emotional and moral distances between themselves and the unpleasant side of diffusion. They wrung their hands as Coffles and Georgia men passed, or they asserted that slaves lived better in the new states than in the old. But while Washington contended that forced migration was carried out for the benefit of enslaved people, one observer, who stood in Leesburg in August 1821 and watched as Bushrod Washington's coffle went by, saw unhappy wretches, among whom were husbands who had been torn from wives and children, and many relatives left behind. Those left at Mount Vernon whispered bitter words to tourists who visited the National Father's home. Between the end of the American Revolution and the Fletcher versus Peck decision in 1810, slavery's expansion linked the nation together. The needs of the nation encouraged the growth of a complex of institutions and patterns, and, just as significantly, excuses that made national political and financial alliances possible. The needs of individual enslavers and others who hoped to profit from the expansion of all sorts of economic opportunities encouraged the growth of a more powerful set of national capabilities, more market-friendly laws, and more unified markets. The needs of national expansion, plus the ability of chained people to walk, trapped enslaved people as absolutely held property in the political compromises, political alliances, and financial schemes of the United States, and in the very map of the young country. Slavery, and specifically the right of enslavers to sell and to move their slaves into new territory, became a national practice, as a strict definition of property under constitutional law, as habit and expectation, and as a pattern of political compromise. Turning this wheel of cause and effect were moving feet, those of Charles Ball, of the 32 other men to whom he was connected, of the 19 women roped together behind them, and others still growing toward sellable height. From old Maryland and Virginia, which were crumbling beneath the glossy veneers offered to the world by their politicians, the coffle chains and the people who toted them clanked across hundreds of miles into a new world where everything was flux and frolic. Forced migration and the expansion of slavery became a seemingly permanent and inevitable element of the mutually agreed-to structure of lies that, defended by the agile legal realism of Marshall and the myth of diffusion, made the nation. To put the machine in motion, Washington could now rely on a set of chaining experts, Georgia men who took the financial and physical and status risks of moving enslaved people. Charles Ball could now be moved more easily in every sense, with less political, ideological, legal, and personal friction. Thus, the coffle chained the early American Republic together. In South Carolina, Charles Ball's neck and hands were finally freed of the coffle's chains, but only so his owner could finish the chain's work of converting Charles and the other remaining Maryland slaves into market goods. Because they had left sweat from pores and pus from blisters on the road, and had drawn down their meager stores of body fat, the Georgia man rested them for 20 days at a property owned by a cotton farmer. Ball and his companions were given butter to eat so they would become sleek and fat. The lice were driven from their bodies and clothes by repeated washing. And soon, white people began to come and examine them, ask them questions, speculate on their bodies. Here, the Georgia man was among people who respected him, calling him merchant instead of Negro driver or Georgia trader. Here he was needed, and not as the scapegoat for other enslavers' sins. He even let his name drop from his tight lips. "My name is McGiffin, sir," he said in response to a prospective buyer's inquiry. After 2 weeks, McGiffin moved the drove of slaves south into Columbia. There, on the 4th of July, the local jailer auctioned them off in front of a crowd of hundreds who had just finished eating a fine banquet and listening to a patriotic speech. The sale eventually narrowed down to the last 3, the stoutest men, including Ball. The jailer now theatrically announced that if McGiffin did not get $600 for each man, he would take them to Georgia and sell them there. An elderly gentleman announced that he would pay that amount for the carpenter. Ball was not really a carpenter, but many lies were told on that day that celebrated freedom from tyranny. Not one of the slaves for sale had ever run away, or stolen from their masters, or been whipped. Each was sold by a fine Maryland or Virginia gentleman who had sadly fallen into debt. The other whites deferred to this elderly man. Ball pegged him as the major slave owner. He was actually one Wade Hampton, among other things, a major Yazoo investor. Having inherited rice plantation wealth in the Low Country, Hampton was in the process of shifting his slaves into cotton, for now on acres he owned near Columbia, South Carolina. Later, his quest for wider vistas would lead him into Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana endeavors. Today, however, Hampton was drinking and celebrating the 4th. He told Charles to find a corner of a stable and go to sleep. The next day, they would make the trip to Hampton's nearby property, one last step of the journey that Ball's feet had made from the old to the new. 2. Heads, 1791 to 1815. The logs bobbed around the pilings of the custom house. The hut stood on legs, a chicken up to its drumsticks in shallow water, besieged by a continent stew. Anything that could last a month in water ended up down here at the Belize, the flats at the Mississippi's mouth. Bark, sticks, whole trees, if they didn't get hung up along 1,000 miles of snags. Deer and drowned wild cattle didn't make it. Catfish and turtles ate them long before they could come this far. The heaviest load of all flowed under the rippling corduroy of forest waste, a mighty subsurface plume of water, fresh but not sweet, sagging with its load. Iron from the far north, silver from Rocky Mountain lodes, and most of all, dirt. Humus rinsed from the banks of 10,000 forest tributaries tumbled past Jefferson's would-be 16 states, stirred with black soil from the delta. For an eon, the river had piled up silt, marching its outlet southward on its own. But for the past decade, the runoff slurry had been thickening. Upriver, someone was plowing, planting, harvesting. It was the beginning of 1807. Looking over the side of the Adventine, as it bobbed at anchor in the ship channel, was a short, dark man. He had been the only slave on board since Charleston. The crew paid him no mind. He was neither a threat nor the main cargo. He still didn't understand what they said, and they did not understand him. But they no longer feared that he'd jump, like the Africans they'd wrestled back over the rails on Atlantic crossings. There were two startling things about him. One was that when he slept, he always curled up in the same position. The other was that he wore an iron collar around his neck, inscribed with the words, "Property of Hugh Young." Behind his eyes, he remembered. Coming from Africa to South Carolina, he had gone through what 10 million other forced migrants to the New World had already survived. Captured or kidnapped, or simply bought, marched to the coast, sold by strange men to even stranger men, some milky-colored, some angry red, some tan with dark curly hair. Out of the darkness of the dungeon in chains, hand and foot, one of a whole stick of African men bundled by the white sailors into the big coastal canoe, feeling the salt spray as it flushed over the gunwales. They plunged through rough waves to a floating structure and were hauled on board the Rhode Island ship. Herded below with shoves, they took dainty, quick steps to stay balanced under a 4-foot ceiling, too short for even these men, who barely averaged 5 feet. The air stank from men already curled on the floor in front of them. Their predicament showed the new arrivals how to lie, spoon fashion, on the left. Easier on the heart that way, captains believed. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention had allowed the trade to go on. In the 20 years since, citizens of the new nation had dragged 100,000 more people from the African coast. Always, some fought. They clung to the doorposts of the dungeons and barracoons. They threw themselves in chained groups over the gunwales of the boats to drown together in the surf. They grabbed at the clubs the sailors used to beat them down onto the slave deck. They rushed the barricade when the crew let them out for exercise. 10% of Atlantic slave trade voyages experienced major rebellions. But resistance almost always failed. Sailors fired grape-shot cannon into surging masses of desperate men and women in the midships. The scuppers ran with blood. The sharks ate. Now the man remembered how he had lain in vomit and shit and piss. How he had eaten from the bucket they brought. He heard the women on the other deck crying for a dying baby or sister. Heard them fight as the sailors took them into the crew's quarters one by one to be raped. He saw them drag out men who had gone stiff and grinning. The angel's fingers clawed at him, too. He puked up everything down to the bile. Barely survived the dysentery that emptied out 100, sweated from cargo fevers. He panted, waiting for the water pail's ladle. He could have died, like millions of others, but he lived on. Perhaps he was lucky. At last the ship dropped anchor in Charleston Harbor. Then they sold him to a New Orleans merchant's local agent, who locked him into the iron collar that bore the merchant's name. Another white man walked him up East Bay Street toward the Adventine's dock. Signs creaked in the wind that brought the stench of his old ship from Gadsden's wharf. The buzzards lighting and flapping on the other side of the Cooper River knew where the harbor current piled bodies against the sandbar. That year alone, 700 Africans died on the 25 different ships that spent time waiting there in quarantine. Now, after another voyage, the rowboat eased up to the Adventine's hull. The white customs officer scrambled up the rope ladder. The man in the iron collar watched everything. He could tell that the slave who rested on the oars had gone through dark waters too. Behind unblinking eyes, the oarsman gave back the collared man's gaze, and remembered the feel of the slave deck's sweating wood pressing against his ritually scarred cheek. Yet this new arrival's experience would be different. Slavery itself was changing from the first story, the Sugar Island model that had shaped everything in the New World to this point. This man would carry his collar not to an island or to an isolated belt of settlements clinging to the coast. He was headed into a vast continent. Behind the mists on the mudflats, enslavement would find no geographical limit, only political ones, and enslavers had structured politics to their advantage. Citizens, not colonials, would own him. Owners' property interests, owners who got to vote and run for office and govern, would drive decisions about him, not the plans of distant imperial bureaucrats. And because the man in the iron collar and all who followed him into the depths of the continent would make not a luxury product but the most basic commodity in a new kind of endlessly expanding economy, there would also be no limit to the market for the product of his labor. This meant that there was no numerical limit to the number of enslavers or to the number of investors who would want to chase enslavement's rewards. Only conscience, or the inability of the world's investment markets to deploy enough savings, could impede the transfer of capital to slavery's new frontiers. All of this was certain but for the doubt raised by one big question: whether the United States and all the entrepreneurs who wanted to expand slavery into the Great River Valley in the middle of the continent could actually hold on to North America's interior. That outcome was still in doubt, even in 1807. In fact, it had been in doubt since the 1790s, and would continue to be so for almost a decade more. For this reason, slavery's expansion was not a foregone conclusion, and 4 great episodes of violence, 3 of them played out along the river system whose flow rocked the Adventine at anchor, would decide its fate. As of 1807, 4 out of every 5 people who came from the Old World to the New had come from Africa, not Europe, chained in the belly of a ship, not free on its deck, huddled masses in steerage class, yearning to breathe free of the famine and poverty of Ireland, Italy, or Russia's shtetls. They came later. 10 million middle passages of African captives had shaped the New World and its interactions with the Old. The only other shift on a similar scale was the death of millions of the hemisphere's original inhabitants. From the twin realities of demographic catastrophe and middle passage, empires emerged to dominate the first 3 centuries of American history: Spanish, Portuguese, French, and British. Once all the gold and silver had been thoroughly stolen, the empires found even greater sources of wealth by laying a belt of plantation colonies from Brazil north to Virginia. Many were small in size, but all were huge in economic and political significance. In 1763, in the First Treaty of Paris, France traded all of Canada for the island of Guadeloupe. What was made on such islands, and what made much of Europe's new wealth before 1807, was sugar. The Portuguese brought sugarcane to Brazil at the beginning of the 16th century. They'd already learned how to crush it, boil the sap, and crystallize it on Atlantic islands such as Madeira or São Tomé. There, Europeans had first combined the volatile ingredients of sugarcane, fertile land, chattel slavery, and enslaved Africans carried far from their homelands. In Brazil, this solution precipitated not only crystallized sucrose from vats of bubbling cane juice in the brutally demanding safra, or sugar harvest, but also immense revenue. Prestige consumers in the economies of late 16th century Western Europe ate sugar and more sugar. Brazil was, for a time, early modern Europe's Silicon Valley, the incubator of techniques for making massive profits, a synonym for sudden wealth. Robinson Crusoe was going to become a Brazil planter when shipwreck cast him on his desert island. Within 50 years, Barbados shoved Brazil from the top of the sugar heap. The heyday of Barbados lasted only a few decades, for Jamaica rose next to command credit and fame. On island after island, Europeans and their pathogens killed the natives, slave ships appeared on the horizon, and cane sprouted in the fields. Streams of survivors crawled forth from slave ships to replenish the cane field work gangs of men and women as they died. But enslavers grew fabulously rich. On each island, the richest crowded out others. Then a new island came online, offering entrepreneurs the chance to get in on the ground floor with fresher soil, offering investors novelty that attracted new credit. The Sugar Island process of destruction and implantation shaped the geopolitics, economics, and culture of the first 3 centuries of the New World. Virginia and South Carolina were different from the islands, yet they were channels of the same current. The northern colonies were irrelevant until they evolved trades that the islands needed, shipbuilding, grain growing, and livestock raising, and started distilling sugarcane molasses into rum, carrying slaves, and trading in slave-made products. In European shops and kitchens, sugar started as a luxury for the rich. By 1700, it was becoming the sweetener for the new middle class's coffee and tea, also imperial tastes. By 1800, the English poor could sometimes indulge in sugar as a luxury, as a stimulant that got one through a hard day of labor, or a treat to quiet the crying child. Sugar and slavery quickened European trade, broadened the financial capital available to entrepreneurs, whetted the appetite for profit, and increased the revenue and power of centralizing states. But sugar and slavery had not definitively lifted the economies of Western Europe above those of the rest of the planet. China, which also consumed sugar, remained the massive gravitational center of world trade during much of the 18th century. Like the rest of the world, most Europeans were only one bad season from starvation. They all grew food by local traditions of agriculture that in technological complexity, efficiency, and productivity were closer to the year 0 than to 1900. The great masses of the poor and the peasantry were as short as the man in the collar, for living standards for most people had not risen since the dawn of the agricultural era.
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T Renegade. And for second study session, we will pick up. We're in chapter 2. For me, we're on page 129. We'll pick up there for the second audio segment. Be looking forward to hearing commentary from all the folks who have participated. The number to dial is 641-715-3640. And the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. The number again, 641-715-3640. 53640, and the code is 564943 pound. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. We'll be looking forward to hearing from folks who have commentary. I thought that was very important. The last portion of the paragraph that we heard when the audio segment for number 1 concluded. Most Europeans were only one bad season from starvation. They all grew food by local traditions of agriculture that in technological complexity, efficiency, and productivity were closer to the year 0 than to 1900. Very important paragraph, one that I highlighted. We'll nab the folks who dialed in who have commentary. If you dialed in with a hand up, your line should be open. I will nab other hands as I see them. Let's see, retired firefighter, Mr. Demery 4, Thomas in New York, you all should be with us. And as I said, I'll nab other hands as I see them. Feel free.
Yes, greetings. May I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I got my new gadget here, headset. I hope I'm coming in good. So, actually, you know, what I'm beginning to get a picture of from this book is you've got a group of so-called wealthy planners, you know, and I think that's a code word because you could interchange that with racists and capitalists and whatever else you want to, you know, put in there. And these guys are running a syndicate, look like a criminal organization that they're calling the formation of the United States. So, the last time I checked, if you owned another human being and you enslaved people, then that qualifies you as a racist. So that would include at least 8 of our original first presidents. But getting on with this thing, on page 27, you know, it said enslaved people train themselves all their lives in the art of discovering information from white people. I'm just wondering, in a situation like that, when you work in 10, 14, 16 hours a day in the hot fields, whether it's tobacco, sugar cane, cotton, when have you got a lot of time to study white people and discover information from them? Some of the ones that probably worked inside their homes could gather information. But I found I have a little problem with that. The last problem I had about him going into the minds of the enslaved individuals, I think I answered that for myself. A lot of stuff that he wrote about Charles Ball was taken from Slavery in the United States, a narrative of the life and adventures of Charles Ball. So I think he wrote later on narrative that this author used. So that cleared up some of the confusion on how he would know what they were thinking. And I think just the use of the word coffle is a racist act because it demeans the individuals that are chained together and treated like animals, and then you just call it a coffle. But then the coffle of slaves passed by the U.S. Capitol, congressmen out on the front steps smoking cigars, when you're actually witnessing a terrorist act where people were kidnapped and held prisoner in chains, and walking in front of you, you're a lawmaker or legislature, and you're singing Hail Columbia. He may as well have been whistling Dixie. And then this concept about diffusion, that was nonsense. It made no sense at all how you could expand slavery and then diffuse it. I think, as things went along, they changed the laws to fit the situations where they could continue to enslave human beings and to increase their profits as they expand slavery across the United States. And the hypocrisy of it all, because they were under the pretense that it was affecting their consciousness, but at the same time they wanted to expand it. On page 31, when the blacksmith came out and asked the two gentlemen what they were making such a fracas about, then Charles Ball said that down there, the Carolinas, the time when they were most fully themselves was when they were arguing, negotiating, dealing, and intimidating the enslaved, and I would add, with their boots on the back of the necks of enslaved people, is when they feel mostly themselves. When Charles Ball was sold, and they was describing him, they described his previous owner as part of Charles Ball's asset. In other words, he came from this fine gentleman, and the only reason why the gentleman sold him, he fell upon hard times. This stuff is ridiculous, and I'll reserve some of the other remarks until later. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I did want to mention some. I think he mentioned Robinson Crusoe, and that's supposed to be a popular novel in American literature. But this guy, I guess the half has never been told, because if you look closely, Robinson Crusoe was a Brazilian planter. He owned slaves. And when he had a shipwreck that cast him on a desert island, he had already indulged into owning slaves. Okay, I'll mute my line. Thanks, Gus.
For sure. Other folks that had a hand? Yes, sir. Go ahead, retired firefighter.
Yes, I'm just thinking about the practical use of white people. In this case, the author. This information has a level of value because it shows on how deviously deficient the system of racism, white supremacy was at that time, which leads to on how proficient they are today. And I'm in awe of the means and strategy that they were collectively going about doing with us. It's like, I would say definitely below how they treat animals, as far as that concerns, another level, actually. And also, when I think about all of the tools that they use, such as the minerals of the earth, the plant life of the earth, and who had to do the work. And this continues on today. You know, they're talking about sugar, talking about cotton, talking about diamonds, more upon more present times. We did all of the work. We did all of that work, and just how deviously proficient is what I'm hearing. How the white people were back then, and as I mentioned, it still continues on in a very proficient fashion to today. Sometimes they may argue over what's best, but they always are going to decide that we're going to, whatever side wins out is going to be the most proficient way. That's why it's hard for me to understand on any non-white black person that would have anything that could be called forgiveness for these people, and the inherent, in my opinion, the inherent evil that lies within them, and what their intentions have always been with us. And so, from that standpoint, the book, has value to be able to inform any one of us as non-white black victims about the proficiency of the system of racist white supremacy and how it's been proficient in this way, even to us, our bodies, not even having a right to our own bodies. They had total control of our bodies itself, on how proficient it is. In the book, the author, it was I guess is accurate on what he is saying in this book so far. Thank you.
For sure. Roz should be with us, Thomas in New York, and the caller that's on the VOP line, you should be with us also.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Good evening to all. Thomas Smith from New York. Few observations.
We're still on?
Oops, sorry about that. I hit my own mute button. Thomas in New York, I think, got disconnected or at least bumped his mute button, perhaps, because we're not hearing you, Thomas in New York. We're not hearing you.
Can you hear me?
Okay, we can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. Yes. I was just correlating a reading to a commercial that I saw on heritage.com, commercial that comes on with these two black guys that's twins. I don't know if you guys saw that. But, they're talking about how they looked into their heritage, and one guy says, I wish I could go back 150 years ago. Then I'm like, this guy's crazy, because I don't think you want to go back 150 years ago. And this reading just pretty much laid that out. The whites who wanted to end slavery and expand it at the same time, to me, those are the original white privileged people, the original 10 Wises. They could talk about it one way, but still be practicing it another. And so that stood out to me. They moved blacks like drugs, like in the 80s, down and up the I-95. Bring it from New York, you buy it for $300, you bring it to the South, you sell it for $6. I mean, slaves were the first drugs. The land was a plantation to the white men, it meant nothing more to them. They destroyed the ecosystem everywhere they went and on the islands. And then they just move on to the next one, move on to the next state. And, I'm going to keep that in mind next time I hear white people talking about how much they love this country and love this land. Nah, y'all didn't love it. Y'all was just trying to take all you can from it. What confused me about the reading, and I questioned the accuracy on the Islam. He said one of the slaves practiced Islam. And it was, at least from my research, 70 to 80 years before Islam actually existed. So I just want to keep that in mind. I might have to call up Professor Walter Williams on that one. Chained together, shackled, hammered together, Unfortunately, I've been in handcuffs before, and that numbness that comes from your wrist and thumb is unforgettable. And I could just imagine, what these people felt like. It lasts for weeks, and then you can't pee, you can't, use the bathroom, causing the arguments among slaves because one's walking too fast, one's walking too slow. I mean, just very brilliant how they work that whole thing together. Of course, everyone's mad at each other, but they're not mad at the man making them walk. Very smart. Blistered up, beaten down, thin. They let them rest for 20 days. It sounded like the NFL combine. They expect the bodies. They go and talk to the people to see how they feel. Isn't that the same thing they do to the pro athletes today? Give them psychological tests, physical tests before they say, "Oh, we'll buy that Negro." So very interested in the end of the passage when he said China has always been the center of world trade, or China was the center. China has always been the center of world trade. What he failed to leave out was the African slave labor in China. Instead of plantations, they worked in these things called hongs, factories. And the Portuguese, the English, the British, the Spanish would bring their slaves there to work in those factories for 6 months out the year. And the Chinese were working on the other 6 months out the year. So they failed to leave that out. And that's it. I'll mute my line. Thank you.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
All right. Greetings. Greetings to you, Gus, and to all the callers and listeners. This is Ross, and I had a few things. I thought it was start with what you brought up as far as the last segment, where they said exactly what you were talking about, where they discussed. They said, where is it? Like the rest of the world, Europeans were only one bad season from starvation. They all grew food by local traditions of agriculture, and that in technological complexity, efficiency, and productivity were closer to year zero than 1900. I see that as another inaccuracy by the author as well, and I believe he was practicing racism. The reason why is because Africans for tens of thousands of years had quite massive agricultural societies and were able to sustain large groups of people. This is going back to the Nile Valley all the way to West Africa. This is something that was that we've been doing longer than any other people on the planet. White people knew that, so basically them kidnapping us and forcing us to work on plantations was something that they knew they would benefit from due to the fact that they could not plant on a massive scale or provide any sort of agriculture for their people, but they knew that we did. So that's something I think definitely was a historical inaccuracy. I found something else interesting that he wrote on page 42. He says, within 50 years, Barbados shoved Brazil from the top of the sugar heap. The heyday of Barbados lasted only a few decades, while Jamaica rose next to command credit and fame. On island after island, Europeans and their pathogens killed natives, and slave ships appeared on the horizon, and kings sprouted in the fields. This is interesting because a lot of the intra-island beefing that takes place between different Caribbeans, like my family's from Trinidad and Tobago, there's a lot of beefing between, let's say, Jamaica and Trinidad, or Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, Trinidad and Barbados. All of those kinds of things were instigated by white supremacists, and that was through that same competition that he's discussing. Different islands were vying for the title of being the best, basically the best slave economy. And as a result, those beefs or those issues that whites instigated and fanned the flames of actually have perpetuated intergenerationally till today, in a lot of ways in which we see how different islanders speak about each other and sometimes mistreat one another. So that was something that I thought was very interesting. Then speaking to the Islam issue too that Thomas had brought up earlier, I found that interesting too because in West Africa, Islam had gotten there long before Christianity. And when white people first started to kidnap Africans from West Africa, they basically were fighting with Arabs for control over the slave trade in the West. When they finally came to an agreement, the Arabs said that they will continue to kidnap Africans from the East, and the Europeans would continue to kidnap Africans from the West. And what they also taught the Europeans was to kidnap Africans from different tribes so that they could not communicate, simply because the Arabs had learned from kidnapping large groups of Africans from the same area that facilitated a lot of revolts because they would be able to plot in secret. And they basically taught the Europeans how to kidnap us in a way that was most effective to perpetuate white supremacy. Also, I found a story about Jack Neal, a shining example of black self-respect. I found it an example of, in my opinion, of maximum compensatory justice when he decided to try and free himself by any means necessary. I found that very, very, very good. And he's another ancestor I'll put whose name that will end up on my ancestral altar due to the work that he did and the fact that he gave his life to try and free our people. Also, the portion that Thomas Smith brought up in regards to black people arguing and fighting with each other while being chained, it also made me think of how Europeans set up the projects where they stack black people one on top of the other in these tight, closed spaces, and then we kill each other off just like rats that you put in a cage. If you fill a cage with too many rats, eventually the rats will start tearing away at each other, not understanding they're in a confined space controlled by the person outside the cage who put them there in the first place. So I found that to be very very interesting as well and very telling. And also the fact that white people would use slavery as a means to try and one-up on each other, perform one-upmanship on one another in order to try and gain control. And this is speaking to the sections about Thomas Jefferson and bringing the slave coffles through Virginia and the embarrassment that would ensue behind that, and those whites that would try and use the slave coffles as a means to belittle those whites that were overtly in favor of slavery and racism and white supremacy. It's just interesting that they didn't think about any of the moral value of what they were doing. It was more about one-upmanship and trying to dominate the ways that the system of white supremacy would be practiced. Another section that was interesting was on page 32. There was a section that says the coffle helped to make Ball's enslavement deeper and more flexible. It moved his marching feet to the needs of the nation's most successful people. It provided defenses for those who did not want to deal with their own half-hearted moral failure with the inclusion of slavery in the new state constitutions. That was a shining example of the refinement of white supremacy and the fact that they have been refining white supremacy for a very long time. And just like I believe it was the firefighter in Florida, they've done the most brilliant job at actually refining the system of white supremacy. And then I also thought there was one last section that I really wanted to talk about too, where, right here, it's on page 36. It says here, the Georgia man was among people who respected him, calling him merchant instead of Negro driver or Georgia trader. Here he was needed and not as the scapegoat for other enslavers' sins. He even let his name drop from his tight lips. My name is McGiffin, or McGiffin, sir, he said in response to a prospective buyer's inquiry. And that speaks to something that you had discussed before in the reading of Urugu, as how white supremacy is written into the language. So even the term merchant comes from the white supremacist standpoint of using us as chattel, and we use that term so loosely, just like the term buck. Like you always talk about using that term buck. Now I look at merchant the same way, simply because it used to mean Negro driver, basically slave trader, or and Georgia trader was also another way of saying slave trader. So they refined it into the term merchant, and now it's a respected title, and these people can walk around and sell our ancestors and abuse them at will, and are looked at with our pride and respect. That's all I wanted to contribute, but this book is really something, and we really have to sift through a lot of this author's white supremacist leanings and his ability to doctor the truth when telling our story. Thank you so much.
The other people who dialed in who had not shared yet, caller on the vote line and caller at 1501, did you all have commentary?
May I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I had two things that I noticed in particular. The first thing, I guess, was mentioned by the other two callers, is that one of the things I didn't like, I guess, is that he gives you sort of a context for European history before enslavement or what was going on, and you don't really get a sense of what's actually going on in Africa, or even an overview, which kind of, to me, just seems like Africa is this land of really nothingness until people are enslaved. I kind of would have liked more context there. And the second thing is how he explained sexual violence or sexual abuses and rape, is that I don't think all of because there are some accounts that discuss, folks that discuss this in minor detail, about same-sex sexual violence, I always find it interesting that it's always assumed that it's only white men on enslaved women, and none of these. I find it difficult to imagine that none of these black men aboard were also experiencing sexual violence. I don't know if it's a flaw in the accounts he got, or just something I noticed.
Oh, is that it, sir?
Yeah, that's it. Sorry.
Oh, okay. No apology needed. Just making sure. Caller at 1501. 1501. Did you have commentary as well? (1501). Are you just listening, or did you have commentary? Not hearing you, in case you hit your mute button or what have you. Okay, might not be in an area where they can talk right now. Double check before we get to the second audio segment.
Muted. Unmuted.
A couple quick comments before we double check to see if anybody else has anything that they want to get in before we get to the second audio segment. When I said last week, I think Thomas in New York was asking about some of the different crops other than cotton that were explosive and intricately tied to the torture, mutilation, theft, and enslavement of black people. Sugar, definitely high on the list. Tobacco as well. I don't know if I said sugar last week. I think I said rum, but that's just a derivative from sugar. In one of the books, I think I mentioned it last week. I just didn't give the title. Sugar in the Blood. Andrea Stewart. She is a black female victim of racism. It came out in 2013. Got quite a bit of publicity at the time, but it deals with the history of sugar and slavery and rape in the Caribbean. Folks might want to check that out. She's outside the States. I think she's in the UK. But Sugar in the Blood, Andrea Stewart. That is her name. Back to the text. Some of the things that I picked out. Let's see. For me, and again, my pages might not match up. I have the ebook version. Page 88, where it says, it's in chapter 1, indeed, access to large supplies of surplus slaves from the Chesapeake was the best form of currency for buying land that one could possess. And that's something I think that we discuss on a pretty regular basis. I think Mr. Fuller emphasizes that black people, under the system of white supremacy, non-white people in total being thought of as currency, that we are a form of money for racist man, racist woman. You see it, pretty explicitly throughout pretty much all the book that we have discussed thus far. Let's see some of the other things that I had. This is on page 94. They had shackled him to the side of the boat, but one night Neil worked loose the staple that fastened the iron chain to wood. He crept along the deck to his sleeping captor, slit the white man's loaded pistol from his pocket, and blew the man's brains out. Neil then went to the far end of the boat where another white man was steering and announced, "Damn you, it was your time once, but it is mine now." Great illustration of black self-respect. And again, I emphasize, I think pretty much every book that we read, this pops up, where you have black people who are not chumps, who are not lames, who just take anything that white people dump out on them. Is tons of these examples. I again strongly assert that that's one of the major aspects of racism, white supremacy, to really downplay these events. This is not in Gone with the Wind. This is not in many of the other fables, the help that white people love to crank out about racism, white supremacy, where you don't see this unless they give it to you in Django Unchained or some other nonsense. But they just do a really great job of downplaying this and acting like you just didn't have this. This just didn't occur, and nothing could be further from the truth. And I think Dr. Gerald Horne, fantastic historian, black scholar, he's written whole books about this, how that's a major aspect of racism. That's one of his whole books is about black rebellions in this part of the world and black people killing white people. And you had that all the way up to today. You don't have to go back this far. That you still have black people doing this very thing today, 2015. Moving forward. When this is on page 96 for me, then wrote the traveler, each white man took a female from the drove to lodge with him, as is the common practice. hugely important in my opinion, particularly the last part of that sentence, as is the common practice. Again, the Daniel Holtzclaw, this is not new. This is white culture. This is an integral aspect of racism, white supremacy, sexual terrorism of black people. Thought it was a great point the caller brought out, that this always gets presented pretty much as a white men raping black females. It does not, the total spectrum of this sexual tyranny, when it's white men raping black males, white men raping black children, male and female, and white women raping black males and or black females and or black children. There are some texts that call this out, but it's very rare, and that's another aspect that really should be fleshed out in total, because this continues all the way up present day as well. Abner Louima, or you can pick any other illustration. Even Eric Garner, before he was killed, had lodged a complaint about having all these cavity searches out in the middle of the street by New York's finest, and his objections to that and the humiliation of it all. This long-running practice on the plantation, the system of white supremacy. Moving forward, let's see. Yeah, the bickering, where it's, for me, this is on 97, John Parker chained in the coffle as a preteen, remembered a weaker boy named Jeff who was bullied until John came to his aid, helping him stand up against a big teenager who was taking food from the younger children. None of that mattered to the Georgia man as long as the chain kept moving and Ball led the file down through Virginia into North Carolina at a steady pace. I think Thomas in New York articulated that beautifully, how this is also a long-running aspect of racism, white supremacy, where I think Dr. Welsing said that's really one of the predictable responses to white terrorism, where we take our aggression out on each other. And really that's a lot of times the way that white people funnel our aggression, to take it out on one another, and particularly weaker, more vulnerable victims of racism, white supremacy. I think that would be another aspect of black self-respect, this person standing in and trying to stop some of this mistreatment of another enslaved black person. Great sentence, which enslaved people train themselves all their lives in the art of discovering information from white people. Wow. I wish there was more of that right now. I'm sure it is happening to some degree, but really processing and with the understanding, I would only add in, with the understanding that we are studying our enemies, not that these are saints and that this is white Jesus, and these are wonderful, great, the most intelligent people ever. But no, these are our enemies who are dedicated to terrorizing, mutilating, torturing us, raping us forever, and we should be studying them to permanently solve this problem. But I thought that was a hugely important sentence there. Rhetorical ethic, to mention Dr. Marimba Ani again, Yurugu, book that we did before. That term kept coming to mind throughout, where they're talking about trying to embarrass white people, where they're going through the nation's capital and they've got all these black people in shackles and taking them off to be sold somewhere, and this is going to embarrass white people. I think she eloquently in the book breaks down that is total nonsense, thinking that you are going to somehow embarrass or shame white people about what they do to black people. It would be something, you would be deviant if you were not abusing, mistreating black people and proud of it. Then it would be something to be disgraceful. Then it would be something to be ashamed about if you were not on board with the practice of racism, white supremacy. And I think he touched on that in the book last week, where they talked about where they had people that were white people that were allegedly speaking out against the enslavement and abuse of black people. And it was like, wait a minute, we're not going to have that. And they would pass laws so that these people could not give these type of speeches and restrict what they were going to be able to write or say publicly if they were going to be acting like they had a critique of black enslavement. And I think that long record of that, not something that is just restricted to what they call colonial America. Moving forward, the passage for me, this is a 103, but they almost never fought over slavery. During the 1800 election, a few Northern Federalists charged Jefferson with keeping a harem of enslaved lovers at Monticello, but Southern Federalists and most Northern ones kept the slavery question sheathed. I thought that was important for 2 points. Number one, again, how common, how consistent the rape of black people is. That just keeps coming up. And second, the also theme I think that has come up quite a bit in this book so far, in the early portion at least, white people being on board, even white people who I might not directly be a slave owner or, involved. I'm not the Georgia man doing this, but I'm still on board. I'm still going to represent for the white team, and I see this as in the overall white interest to be in support of this. So, hey, we have no criticism. Let's rock and roll. Let's keep going with enslaving and torturing these black people. Oh my God, yeah, I think Mr. Demery Ford, I thought that was hugely important, where Mr. Ball, where he said he realized that Carolinians, white people, the time when they were most fully themselves was evidently when they were arguing, negotiating, dealing, and intimidating the enslaved. I think that is still true today. That's the time when you can most accurately see what it means to be white and their enjoyment. Again, as I said before, there's no shame, there's no disgrace about this. This is when they can be Donald Trump, when they can be their authentic selves. Let's see. Anything else I wanted to make sure I get in? I thought the whole running narrative commentary on the Georgia men, for me, even the notion of there being some sort of shame or, oh my gosh, we've got to watch this. I might be a white person, I might be a racist, I'm with slavery, I have no problem with that at all, but I don't want to watch this. I don't want this on my front porch to have to see these niggers in their shackles and then being shuffled off to wherever they're going to work and be raped and tortured and everything else. Again, I think there might be some white people where they might not want to see this, but again, it's not out of I'm ashamed or I feel bad about this. You all do what you do, just don't have it directly in front of me. And I think that carries out on to today, where white people, they're totally cool with anything that's going to be dumped on black people. Maybe I don't want it on my front porch or what have you. I want to have my nice secluded spot over to the side, and we do whatever we do to the niggers. I don't want it in front of my children and myself every day. We're just trying to chill. We can do all that stuff off to the side. I think that's long running, not to be confused with white opposition to racism, white supremacy, which I, again, submit rhetorical ethic. That's just white people lying and being cute with words. I think you all already hit the diffusion aspect. Moving into chapter 2. I thought it was hugely important as well, where he says up to, I think it was 1807, that 80% of the people who came here were enslaved black people. Just for perspective in terms of the population, I thought that was just hugely important. Let's see, we had more of the rape where he talks about the sailors taking down. Anything else? The last passage, I think some people said that they didn't think it was historically accurate. I'll just read it one more time. Most Europeans were only one bad season from starvation. They all grew food by local traditions of agriculture that in technological complexity, efficiency, and productivity were closer to the year zero than to 1900. My interpretation of that is not a commentary on African practices with regards to agriculture. That is a commentary, really, an indictment of what white people were doing prior to coming in contact with whatever technological expertise that black people had. That white, and I've heard many people say this regularly, that white people in Europe did not have the know-how in terms of growing different crops, how to do this efficiently, effectively, and that they were dependent on that expertise from black people. So I did not read this as a criticism or condemnation of African backwardness, that they didn't know how, that this was an indictment of European ignorance with regards to this technology and expertise, which I have heard many people say that is accurate, that they just didn't have this before, and how the squalor that they were in and that they needed enslavement to raise their quality of life. I did not think that was historically, I did not think that was an error. I didn't think that was the author practicing racism. I thought that was totally accurate and consistent with what I've heard before about what white people in quote-unquote Europe, what they were doing at that time. With that, I will stop there. should have, actually, unless somebody has something in 60 seconds, we're going to go ahead and get to the second audio segment. Oh, the other thing I was going to say, I think this narrator is like rolling. Like it feels like he is reading really, really fast going through this text. I'm trying to compare with other authors that we've heard. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates was the last narrator that we heard. It just seems like they were going a little slower in reading the text. It might make it a bit more challenging. I know for me at least, I felt that way last week. Like, wow, this guy is really flying through the text. I mean, we're moving through the text at a pretty good pace, but to me, it seems like he's reading very, very fast and going through the book. Anywho, unless somebody has something that they can get in like 60 seconds, we will get to the second audio segment. Anybody got something that they can do really quick, 60 seconds?
I just wanted to say for the male caller who was discussing basically the homosexual component of rape in slave culture, a good book to get is Homosexuality and Colonialism by Robert Aldrich, and then also The Delectable Negro. That's it. Thank you.
$30 seconds. Anybody else?
And I want to say that I think that 10% of, I think they said 10% of the enslaved people tried to revolt, I think, or they were revolting, but most of them ended disastrously. Like it didn't work out for the enslaved black people. But I think that's a low number. I'm sure it was more than 10%. That's all I want to say.
Right on. That is one other important tidbit that I had. I said something about that last week. For me, it's on page 27. It's in the introduction where he says, if one should be impressed by those who rebelled because they resisted, one should not be proud of those who did not. And there were very few rebellions in the history of slavery in the United States. That seems to directly contradict the statement that you just mentioned about how 10% of the black people that were enslaved on these ships revolted, and even he's got narratives. I read the one where the Neil, I think was his name, where he steals the gun and blows the white person's brain out. Just from what I've said, again, I think white people have done a very good, and deliberately so, have done an excellent job of downplaying, erasing, minimizing the numbers of rebellions and attempted rebellions of black people in this area of the world, not just from the plantation era of white supremacy, but all the way through. They do a phenomenal job of diluting, eliminating these narratives, so we just think that black people are lames and chumps, and we just take whatever white people dish out and we don't fight back, and nothing could be further from the truth. With that, folks have additional commentary, just make notes, and we'll have ample time to get to it after the second audio segment concludes. Should be working your brain computer, processing the information. Definitely encourage folks to remember this is a white author, so if anything sticks out that you think, hey, we should make note of, could be the author, Edward Baptist, Practicing Racism, White Supremacy. Let us know when we're done with this section. We'll go ahead and get started. Again, this is The Half Has Never Been Told. Edward Baptist. We're in Chapter 2, Head. And for me, we're at the bottom of 129.
On the quarterdeck, the white customs officer huddled with the captain. They walked over and stared at the man in the iron collar together, talked gibberish. The captain signed a paper, and the customs officer clambered back down. The man was still unnamed in white folks' documents, but ink had captured his presence again. The rowboat slipped back toward the house. The Adventine's sailors pulled and hoisted. Anchors clanked and sails flapped. The wheel spun. The brig slid out into the ship channel. The man in the iron collar watched from the rail. The mist peeled back and a low, flat landscape came into view. For the next few days, the Adventine tacked with the river's winding turns through the new land made by the Mississippi. Slowly, the banks rose. Low levees protected the flat land that lay behind. Mud gave way to green cane. First he saw occasional huts, and then large houses surrounded by huts. 3 days later, the river turned right and straightened, and a small forest grove of masts came into view. They were at New Orleans. In 1800, French traveler Pierre-Louis du Vallon had seen a smaller forest of masts, but he saw enough to prophesy that New Orleans was destined by nature to become one of the principal cities of North America, and perhaps the most important place of commerce in the New World. Projectors, visionaries, and investors who came to this city founded by the French in 1718 and ceded to the Spanish in 1763 could sense the same tremendous possible future. Sitting at the mouth of a river system greater in economic potential, according to du Vallon, than the Nile, the Rhine, the Danube, or the Ganges, New Orleans would be the great receptacle of the produce of half a continent. Even fancy in her happiest mood cannot combine all the felicities of nature and society in a more absolute degree than will actually be combined in New Orleans, du Vallon said. Yet powerful empires had been determined to keep the city from the United States ever since the 13 colonies achieved their independence. Between 1783 and 1804, Spain repeatedly revoked the right of American settlers further upriver to export their products through New Orleans. Each time they did so, Western settlers began to think about shifting their allegiances. Worried, U.S. officials repeatedly tried to negotiate the sale and cession of the city near the Mississippi's mouth. But Spain, trying to protect its own empire by containing the new nation's growth, just as repeatedly rebuffed them. Spain's stubborn possession of the Mississippi's mouth kept alive the possibility that the United States would rip itself apart. Yet something unexpected changed the course of history. In 1791, Africans enslaved in the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue exploded in a revolt unprecedented in human history. Saint-Domingue, the eastern third of the island of Hispaniola, was at that time the ultimate sugar island, the imperial engine of French economic growth. But on a single August night, the mill of the first slavery's growth stopped turning. All across Saint-Domingue's sugar country, the most profitable stretch of real estate on the planet, enslaved people burst into the country mansions. They slaughtered enslavers, set torches to sugar houses and cane fields, and then marched by the thousand on Cap Français, the seat of colonial rule. Thrown back, they regrouped. Revolt spread across the colony. By the end of the year, thousands of whites and blacks were dead. As the cane fields burned, the smoke blew into the Atlantic trade winds. Refugees fled to Charleston, already burdened by its own fear of slave revolt, to Cuba, and to all the corners of the Atlantic world. They brought wild-eyed tales of a world turned upside down. Europeans, in the throes of epistemological disarray because of the French Revolution's overthrow of a throne more than a millennium old, reacted to these events with a different but still profound confusion. Minor slave rebellions were one thing. Total African victory was another thing entirely. It was so incomprehensible, in fact, that European thinkers, who couldn't stop talking about the revolution in France, clammed up about Saint-Domingue. The German philosopher Georg Hegel, for instance, who was in the process of constructing an entire system of thought around the idealized classical image of a slave rebelling against a master, never spoke of the slave rebellion going on in the real world. Even as reports of fire and blood splattered every weekly newspaper he read, he insisted that African people were irrelevant to a future that would be shaped by the newly free citizens of European nation-states. Yet, the revolution in Saint-Domingue was making a modern world. Today, Saint-Domingue is called Haiti, and it is the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. But Haiti's revolutionary birth was the most revolutionary revolution in an age of them. By the time it was over, these people, once seemingly crushed between the rollers of European empire, ruled the country in which they had been enslaved. Their citizenship would be, at least in theory, the most radically equal yet. And the events they pushed forward in the Caribbean drove French revolutionaries in the National Assembly to take steadily more radical positions, such as emancipating all French slaves in 1794, in an attempt to keep Saint-Domingue's economic powerhouse on the side of the new leaders in Paris. Already, however, the slave revolution itself had killed slavery on the island. An ex-slave named Toussaint Louverture had welded bands of rampaging rebels into an army that could defend their revolution from European powers who wanted to make it disappear. Between 1794 and 1799, his army defeated an invasion of tens of thousands of anti-revolutionary British redcoats. By 1800, Saint-Domingue, though nominally still part of the French Republic, was essentially an independent country. In his letters to Paris, Toussaint Louverture styled himself the first of the blacks. He was communicating with a man rated the first in France, Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul of the Republic, another charismatic man who had risen from obscure origins. Napoleon, an entrepreneur in the world of politics and war, rather than business, used his military victories to destroy old ways of doing things. Then he tried to create new ones, a new international order, a new economy, a new set of laws, a new Europe, and a new empire. But after he concluded the Peace of Amiens with Britain in 1800, the ostensible republican became monarchical. He set his sights on a new goal, restoring the imperial crown's finest jewel, the lost Saint-Domingue. In 1801, he sent the largest invasion fleet that ever crossed the Atlantic, some 50,000 men, to the island, under the leadership of his brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc. Their mission was to decapitate the ex-slave leader of Saint-Domingue. "No more gilded Africans," Napoleon commanded. "Subdue any resistance by deception and force. Return to slavery all the Africans who survived." Napoleon had also assembled a second army, and he had given it a second assignment. In 1800, he had concluded a secret treaty that retroceded Louisiana to French control after 37 years in Spanish hands. This second army was to go to Louisiana and plant the French flag. And at 20,000 men strong, it was larger than the entire U.S. Army. Napoleon had already conquered one revolutionary republic from within. He was sending a mighty army to take another by brute force. As for the Third Republic, when his second army landed in Louisiana, its presence at the head of the Mississippi would destabilize the United States along the fracture line that divided West and East. In Washington, Jefferson heard rumors of the secret treaty. To keep alive his utopian plans for a westward expanding republic of independent white men, he was already compromising with slavery's expansion. Now he saw another looming choice between hypocritical compromise and destruction. No memory rankled Jefferson more than a humiliation he had endured back in 1786, when he and John Adams had been presented to the British royal court as the rebel republic's ambassadors. When a periwigged herald had brayed out the American envoys' names, George III, still furious, ostentatiously turned and waddled away as courtiers snickered. And yet, as Jefferson now instructed his envoy to Paris, Robert Livingston, "There is on the globe one single spot, the possessor of which is our natural and habitual enemy. It is New Orleans." Jefferson had to open the Mississippi one way or another. "Should a French army occupy New Orleans," wrote Jefferson, "we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation." Napoleon had his own visions. He ignored Jefferson's initial offer for the city at the mouth of the Mississippi. So the president sent future President James Monroe with a higher bid, $10 million for the city and its immediate surroundings. Yet, in the end, Paris would not decide this deal. When Leclerc's massive army had disembarked in Saint-Domingue, the French found Cap Français, a smoldering ruin, burned as part of scorched earth strategy. Leclerc successfully captured Toussaint by deception and packed him off to France, to be imprisoned in a fortress in the Jura Mountains. Resistance, however, did not cease. The army Louverture had built began to win battles over the one Napoleon had sent. French generals turned to genocide, murdering thousands of suspected rebels and their families. The terror provoked fiercer resistance, which, along with yellow fever and malaria, killed thousands of French soldiers, including Leclerc. By the middle of 1802, the first wave of French forces had withered away. Napoleon reluctantly diverted the Louisiana army to Saint-Domingue. Then, the second expedition to the Caribbean was also destroyed. So even as Toussaint Louverture shivered in his cell across the ocean, the army he left behind became the first to deal a decisive defeat to Napoleon's ambitions. "Damn sugar, damn coffee, damn colonies," The first of the whites was heard to grumble into his cup at a state dinner. On April 7, 1803, Louverture's jailer entered the old warrior's cell and found the first of the blacks seated upright, dead in his chair. The same day, Monroe's ship hove into sight of the French coast, and on April 11, before Monroe's stagecoach could reach Paris, a French minister invited Livingston to his office. Napoleon's minion shocked Livingston almost out of his knee breeches with an astonishing offer. Not just New Orleans, but all of French Louisiana, the whole west bank of the Mississippi and its tributaries. Now the United States was offered, for a mere $15 million, 828,000 square miles, 530 million acres, at 3 cents per acre. This vast expanse doubled the nation's size. Eventually, the land from the Louisiana Purchase would become all or part of 15 states. It still accounts for almost a quarter of the surface area of the United States. By the late 20th century, Jefferson's windfall would be feeding much of the world. One imagines that Livingston found it hard to hold his poker face steady. He immediately agreed to the deal. So it was that as 1804 began, 2 momentous ceremonies took place. Each formalized the consequences of the successful overthrow, by enslaved people themselves, of the most profitable, most fully developed example of European imperial sugar slavery. One of the ceremonies took place in Port-au-Prince and was held by a gathering of leaders who had survived the Middle Passage, slavery, revolution, and war. On January 1, they proclaimed the independence of a new country, which they called Haiti, the name they believed the original Taino inhabitants had used before the Spaniards killed them all. Although the country's history would be marked by massacre, civil war, dictatorship, and disaster, and although white nations have always found ways to exclude Haiti from international community, independent Haiti's first constitution created a radical new concept of citizenship. Only black people could be citizens of Haiti. And who was black? All who would say they rejected both France and slavery and would accept the fact that black folks ruled Haiti. Thus, even a white person could become a black citizen of Haiti as long as he or she rejected the assumption that whites should rule and Africans serve. Not only did Haitian independence finish off Napoleon's schemes for the Western Hemisphere, but it also sounded the knell for the first form of New World slavery. On the Sugar Islands, productivity had depended on the continual resupply of captive workers ripped from the womb of Africa. Many Europeans who had not been convinced of the African slave trade's immorality were now convinced that it had brought destruction upon Saint-Domingue, by filling it full of angry men and women who had tasted freedom at one point in their lives. British anti-slave trade activism, frightened into a pause in 1791 by heads severed by the Saint-Domingue rebels and Paris guillotines, became conventional London wisdom. In 1807, the British Parliament passed a law ending the international slave trade to its empire. In the near future, Britain's government and ruling class, confident that their own abolition of the trade had provided them with what historian Christopher Brown has aptly called moral capital, would use the weight of their growing economic influence to push Spain, France, and Portugal toward abolishing their own Atlantic slave trades. Meanwhile, the U.S. Congress had already been pushing forward its own bill to ban the international slave trade to the United States, starting in 1808, the first year that the Constitution permitted it. But this slave trade ban, urged by Thomas Jefferson in his 1806 annual message to Congress, was a political possibility in part because the Middle Passage was no longer seen as an economic necessity. Feet marching west, south, and southwest enable slaveholders in the new western districts of South Carolina, Georgia, and elsewhere to buy from an endless coffle of people like Charles Ball. Thus, the bill's passage did not mean that the Southern representatives who voted for it believed that slavery was wrong. As one of them insisted proudly, "A large majority of people in the Southern states do not consider slavery as a crime." In any case, the Haitian Revolution had already made it possible for the United States to open up the Mississippi Valley to the young nation's internal slave trade. About 10 days before the Declaration of Independence in Port-au-Prince, on December 22, 1803, Louisiana's new territorial governor had accepted the official transfer of authority in New Orleans. American acquisition depended on the sacrifices of hundreds of thousands of African men, women, and children who in Saint-Domingue rose up against the one social institution whose protection appeared to be written into the U.S. Constitution, the enslavement of African people. This reliance on the success of the Haitian Revolution was a profound irony. Jefferson, whose argument for diffusion relied in part on exploiting white fears of slave revolt, did not acknowledge that Toussaint's posthumous victory made the nation's and slavery's expansion possible. The only voice pointing out that the Republican president was an emperor without clothes came from Jefferson's old rival Alexander Hamilton, who wrote that, "To the deadly climate of St. Domingo, and to the courage and obstinate resistance made by its black inhabitants, are we indebted." The truth is, Bonaparte found himself absolutely compelled, and not by Jefferson, to relinquish his daring plan of colonizing the banks of the Mississippi. Even today, most U.S. history textbooks tell the story of the Louisiana Purchase without admitting that slave revolution in Saint-Domingue made it possible. And here is another irony. Haitians had opened 1804 by announcing their grand experiment of a society whose basis for citizenship was literally the renunciation of white privilege. But their revolution's success had at the same time delivered the Mississippi Valley to a new empire of slavery. The great continent would incubate a second slavery, exponentially greater in economic power than the first. So the man in the iron collar was a sign not of the passing of an old forced migration, but of the conception of a new one. Yet acquisition of territory doesn't automatically translate to control. Potential wealth doesn't translate automatically into floods of money. To convert possibility into reality in the Mississippi Valley, enslavers would have to work together across linguistic and cultural difference, find new sources of slaves, especially after 1807, and defeat challenges to their power. And had we been able to interview William C. Claiborne, governor of the Orleans Territory, on May 15, 1809, he might have had a pessimistic assessment of their chances. On that day, he was frantically scrawling a letter from his desk in the Cabildo, a white stone structure that stood on the Place d'Armes in New Orleans. Built by the Spanish, the Cabildo now houses the Louisiana State Museum, but in the years after the 1804 change of flags, it was the nerve center of government on the frontier of empire. Claiborne was a man in a hurry. The breakneck pace of his political career had rushed forward frenetically with the expansion of the new United States. Born in Virginia in 1775, he had moved to Tennessee and was in 1795 elected the youngest U.S. representative in history. Powerful Virginia allies had secured him the appointment as federal governor of the newly acquired Orleans Territory, as present-day Louisiana was then termed. But here everything he wanted to accomplish seemed to run aground. Some of it was his fault. He refused to learn French, for instance. He was brusque and tactless, in an existential hurry like his nation. Even now, he leapt up from his seat to look out the window toward the river, then strode hastily back to the desk to scribble, twitching again. For the governor had just received the troublesome news that ships full of slaves had arrived from Cuba and were trying to dock at the port of New Orleans, in contravention of the ban on importing slaves into the United States. The question of importing slaves threatened to amplify rivalries inherent to the nature of this territory. French-speaking residents, conscious of cultural difference, fought in the New Orleans streets with English-speaking Protestants about which dances should be performed at a ball, the ones fashionable in England or the ones popular in France. American women, and a few men, complained that here, wealthy white men sometimes lived with mulatto women until it came time to marry a respectable white one. Such things happened in Virginia. Claiborne knew Thomas Jefferson quite well, but they were usually kept under wraps. Meanwhile, new American arrivals used capital from outside the territory to dominate business that came from New Orleans's now unimpeded access to the products and profits of the interior. French Louisianans could only fall back on their control of the territory's fixed capital, and some tried to shut out American immigrants by refusing to sell them land. Cultural conflict kept alive uncertainty about the loyalties of the newly incorporated peoples of Louisiana. The Spanish Empire still loomed on both the western and eastern frontiers, refusing to give up West Florida. Rumors of plots to detach the Mississippi Valley from Washington's control implicated Spain, French Louisianans who were disloyal to the United States, and overambitious English speakers. The most notorious was the 1806 scheme supposedly organized by former Vice President Aaron Burr and General James Wilkinson, a plan to establish a breakaway republic in Louisiana. Although Wilkinson was a paid agent in the service of Spain, he was not arrested. Burr was, but his subsequent trial for treason devolved into a disaster for Jefferson. The president came out looking like a man eager to twist evidence in order to inflict revenge on a rival. The junior partner on Jefferson's 1800 ticket, Burr, had allegedly tried to steal the presidency by cooperating with Federalists to drive the election into the House of Representatives. Most uncertain of all, in the wake of the revolution in Saint-Domingue, was the future of slavery in Louisiana. The legal records of the Orleans Territory from 1804 through 1810 show a count of 15,927 enslaved people, and scholars have found enough information to make an ethnic identification in 5,527 of the cases. Of those, 61% seem to have been born in Africa, 27% in Louisiana, 6% in the Caribbean, and 6% in Anglo-North America. Ears in New Orleans marketplaces heard dozens of African tongues. Eyes there noted strange country marks, tribal scarifications carved in the faces of men and women coming in from the cane fields. Strange Negroes from Africa seemed particularly prone to resistance. Our quondam friend Mandingo Charles, alias Goliah, has again absconded from the plantation. Also an Igbo man named Cracker, wrote John Palfrey in 1810 from his property Can Brûlé, burnt cane, in St. Charles Parish, 50 miles upriver from New Orleans. Palfrey, a merchant from Massachusetts, had moved to Louisiana in the 1790s to take over his brother-in-law's sugar operation. At the end of 1810, unable to pull the enterprise out of debt, he sold out to New Orleans entrepreneurs William Kenner and Stephen Henderson and launched a cotton-growing operation in the Attakapas region of Louisiana. Cracker stayed in the St. Charles woods. Saint-Domingue was present, in spirit, in the Louisiana that Claiborne was trying to govern. Most of the white constables in the streets of New Orleans had been born on the French island. Sugar and sugar specialists had come to Louisiana from the burned colony too. In 1794, refugee sugar artisan Antoine Morin helped Etienne Boré become the first Louisiana planter to granulate sugar from cane. A little Saint-Domingue sprang up along the great river's German coast, which stretched from St. James Parish down to the city itself. Fields of cane replaced fields of corn. 75 sugar mills were in operation by 1804. Along these 100 miles of development, Army officer Amos Stoddard saw scenes of misery and distress. He added, echoing Jefferson, wounds and lacerations occasioned by demoralized masters and overseers, most of whom exhibit a strange compound of ignorance and depravity, torture the feelings of the stranger, and wring blood from his heart. Good God, why sleeps thy vengeance? Seemingly unable to think beyond a playbook that had already ended in vengeance, Saint-Domingue refugees and their French and Spanish-speaking compatriots demanded more slaves. From their perspective, the Louisiana colony had been long starved of enslaved Africans, having imported fewer than 2,000 in the decade before American acquisition. When Claiborne arrived in 1804, bringing the news that Congress would probably block the international slave trade to the territory, he discovered an almost universal sentiment in favor of this inhuman traffic. The prohibition thereof, he reported, was a great source of discontent among French speakers, but even English-speaking residents agreed that they must import more slaves or be ruined forever. Ruined, and forever. No subject seems as interesting to their minds, wrote one of Claiborne's deputies, as that of the importations of brute Negroes from Africa. Nègre brut, people recently stolen, or, as they also called them, tête, heads. Claiborne reported that a reopened trade would better reconcile French residents to the government of the United States than any other permission which could be extended, though he worried that enslaved Africans would turn Louisiana into another Santo Domingo. In July 1804, however, Louisiana whites learned that Congress was also planning to ban the internal slave trade from other parts of the United States to Louisiana. New Orleans erupted. Public meetings rang with threats of secession. Community leaders besieged Claiborne. The most respectable characters could not, even in my presence, suppress the agitation of their tempers when a check to that trade was suggested. Enterprising types rushed in before the October implementation of the slave trade bans, not bringing the thousands of African Negroes that Claiborne had predicted, but 463 in 6 ships from Africa, and 270 in 3 from Jamaica and Havana. But the next year, Congress passed a law raising Orleans to the same territorial status as Mississippi. The territory's Attorney General, James Brown, a Virginian who owned a German coast sugar plantation, pounced on the loophole this law opened. Mississippi could import enslaved people from other states. Mississippi could even import African slaves transshipped from other ports. Therefore, he insisted, so could the enslavers of the Orleans Territory. Jefferson allowed the ruling on the ground to stand. Slave imports resumed. By ones, like the man in the collar, by twos, and by whole shiploads sent from Africa via Charleston, traders brought hundreds, or perhaps even thousands, of Negre Brut to New Orleans before the legal Atlantic slave trade closed at the end of 1807. In addition, enslavers, including a Tennessee judge named Andrew Jackson, were sending English-speaking enslaved people down the Mississippi River. The new flows of enslaved people into New Orleans began to meet the demands of new arrivals, refugee planters, and old Creole entrepreneurs alike. In a single year, 1804 to 1805, the number of people sold in New Orleans increased almost 5 times over, and average prices dropped as supplies rose. Not all sellers or buyers were white. John Palfrey's overseer reported that he'd bought a Negro wench from a quadroon named John Chassier. Chassier was, Palfrey noted, very persistent in collecting his debt. Thanks to decisions made in London and Washington, the boom didn't last. Great Britain insisted on searching and seizing American merchant ships bound for her enemy France, often kidnapping some of the vessel's sailors into the British Navy. In 1807, Jefferson banned all foreign trade. His theory was that Britain and France would suffer so much that they would agree to respect neutral shipping and allow American vessels to carry American cargoes of tobacco, sugar, and other crops wherever they could find the best market. For 18 months, the government struggled to enforce Jefferson's policy. Rampant smuggling punched holes in the embargo and undermined the presidency's claim to authority at home and abroad. But smuggling couldn't preserve the export-dependent economy of New Orleans, and the embargo chilled slave sales throughout 1808. Finally, 3 days before Jefferson left office, on March 1, 1809, Congress replaced the embargo with the Non-Intercourse Act, which attempted to ban U.S. trade with Britain and France only. So now we are back to May 15, 1809, with Claiborne in his office on the verge of panic because, as the letter he was writing informed his superiors in Washington, a ship from Santiago, Cuba, with a number of French passengers and 36 slaves, was near the city. Many Saint-Domingue refugees had moved to Spanish Cuba. Some of these French nationals had helped to incubate the new Cuban sugar industry. But at the beginning of 1809, when Napoleon invaded Spain, the Spanish Empire retaliated by expelling the refugees from its possessions. Now a shipload of these twice refugees had crossed the bar at the Belize, seeking asylum. A fast messenger boat had run the news up and was waiting for instructions from the governor. Claiborne did not know what to do. The city's many former refugees would be deeply sympathetic to this latest wave, many of whom had left coffee plantations and sugar mills behind them in Cuba. But some brought slaves, and to welcome them in would violate federal law. And before the governor could even finish his first letter to Washington, a letter that was irrelevant since it wouldn't bring a response in time to solve the immediate crisis, the local French consul arrived with news that another 6,000 people were on their way. Claiborne hustled the consul back out as soon as possible, broke the seal on the first letter to Washington, and scrawled a despairing postscript. So great and sudden an immigration to this territory will be a source of serious inconvenience and embarrassment to our own citizens. Claiborne could easily tick off the difficulties the situation presented. There was the problem of finding food, shelter, and employment for 9,000 people in a city that normally supported 15,000. There was the legal problem of bringing slaves. And then again, there was the fact that a third of the refugees were free people of color, forbidden to immigrate to the United States and unwanted by whites in New Orleans, particularly by English speakers who preferred the ostensible clarity of their own American pattern in which all black people were assumed to be enslaved. Yet, over the next few days, the white people of New Orleans held meetings and wrote petitions insisting that they wanted Claiborne to admit the refugees. Sympathy drove them, but so did other forces of attraction. I have no doubt, the mayor of New Orleans wrote to Claiborne, carefully pressing him to admit the refugees and their slaves, that the result would be the settling of many new plantations, which would give large crops of cotton and other produce before 3 years' time. More trade, more connections with other markets, and, this was implied, more unity between white citizens, whatever their native language. Allowing slavery's expansion, the mayor and other wealthy Louisianans insisted, made white New Orleans and white America more prosperous and more united, binding states and factions together. So, Claiborne capitulated. The refugees poured up the river. Congress would, when it heard, quibble, but it backed down and consented to this post facto exception to the 1807 international slave trade ban. The governor himself enforced only a single law. Following territorial regulations to the letter, he expelled all free males of color over the age of 15 who had entered on the refugee ships. Women and children could stay. To the arrivals from Cuba is how A. Bonamy, a Louisiana enslaver, directed his advertisement in the New Orleans newspaper Moniteur de la Louisiane. I will hire 30 nègres de l'âche, slaves of the axe, might be a rough translation, and a number of laboring negresses for long leases. In 1809, the number of slaves sold in New Orleans surged sharply upward. Close to 1/3 of the slaves brought from Cuba were cashed in by enslavers who needed ready funds for a new start. As ever in histories of displacement, people who were ready and able to make profit out of distress did well. One was Christian Miltenberger, a physician of French extraction who had been kicked out of Cuba in 1809. Right before he boarded the ship that would take him to Louisiana, he bought a man named Pierre Louis from fellow refugee Marie-Francois. Pierre Louis had been born a slave in Saint-Domingue and transported to Cuba when his owner fled there at some point between 1791 and 1804, during the Revolution. Miltenberger sold some people once he reached New Orleans, which allowed him to restart his career as a planter, but he didn't sell Pierre Louis. Using the cash from other slave sales, Miltenberger established a small sugar plantation, where he put Pierre Louis to hard labor. The refugees' arrival injected new enslaved laborers and new buyers for land in lower Louisiana. Hard times and cultural dissonance between English and French, and distance from Washington, had slowed the newest West's incorporation into the United States. The incorporation of the refugees helped smooth over those sources of friction. The refugees' slaves accounted for a full quarter of the growth of the Orleans Territory's slave population, from 22,701 to over 34,000 between 1806 and 1810, and for 16% of the 3,000 people sold as slaves in New Orleans between 1809 and 1811. The American Empire expanded instead of devolving into a squabble between local slaveholders over scarce resources. Not everyone in the Mississippi Valley was willing to cooperate. Rival Empire Spain still hoped to block the growth of the United States. So did Britain. And 50,000 Native Americans, who did not plan to surrender the rich soil under their feet, still lived on the millions of acres that Yazoo companies and other speculators had successfully turned into paper on the financial exchanges of America's northeastern cities. These conflicts were coming, and soon. Even sooner, in 1811, the enslaved people who had been brought in such diversity to the Mississippi Valley as heads and slaves of the axe would make their own attempt to change the course of things. Along the river's east bank above New Orleans, on the German coast, dozens of slave labor camps stretched back from the river in French-surveyed long lots, narrow strips of land that ran a mile or two across cleared ground to a dense belt of forested swamps. Their pattern, still visible from the air today, gave the maximum number of large landowners access to the Mississippi. Each holding had a slice of the incredibly rich soil that lay between the levee and the swamps. The swamps themselves were almost impassable, full of alligators, snakes, panthers, and bears. Runaways sought refuge in the swamps, hiding from overseers and free black slave catchers. 40-year-old Philip, also known as Coles, ran away from Kenner and Henderson's new place, John Palfrey's old Can Brûlée, in early November 1810 as the sugar harvest's intense labor began. He'd been brought down the river on a flatboat from Natchez and sold to Kenner and Henderson just that year. A few miles closer to the city was a huge labor camp that still survives as the show plantation Ormond. Pennsylvanian Richard Butler and his business partner Samuel McCutcheon had recently bought dozens of new enslaved people for Ormond, one of whom was 6-foot-tall John. He too had run to the woods in November and had not returned. And somewhere back there, as 1811 dawned, John Palfrey's runaway Cracker still lurked. The sugar harvest ended at the beginning of January. For weeks, overseers and owners had pushed the enslaved drivers, who in turn had pushed the cane cutters, the loaders, and the women who fed the mill with cane in double shifts all day and night. The sugar makers, the artisans, free or slave, who supervised the artful process of boiling, skimming, and crystallizing cane juice into sugar, had also driven their subordinates around the clock. Now, some of the enslaved spent their days loading hogsheads of sugar and molasses onto flatboats and pirogues for transport to New Orleans. Most of the thousands brought in the previous 10 years from Africa and the Caribbean, local-born Louisianans, and a few from Virginia and Maryland as well, labored at dreary January tasks such as digging up minefields of sharp-cut sugarcane stubble, so the next crop of cane could be planted. Had you been out walking near midnight on Saturday, January 5, 1811, you would have heard, from the riverside of the levee that protected Manuel Andri's land from spring floods, the murmuring of men's voices in mixed Creole French and broken English. These men were not just sitting around trading stinging pulls from a jug of tafia, the harsh raw rum made from cane juice. Nor were they simply alternating complaints about women with ragged growls about this overseer or that slave owner. The men were planning what would become the biggest slave rebellion in the United States before the Civil War.
Biggest slave revolt before the Civil War.
And we will pick up there next week. You'll have to tune in next week to find out. Cliffhanger. Context of White Supremacy. And for me, this is 160, chapter 2, 160, where we'll be picking up, 159 for me. And again, my pages might not correspond exactly for people who have, different version of the text. Anywho, the number to dial in is 641-715-3640. The code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. We should have ample time for folks if you had comments you did not get to get in after the first audio segment, and certainly anything dealing with the second audio segment. Feel free to chime in. Everyone who had a hand up or has a hand up, your line should be open. Feel free to participate. No one had any comments? Let's roll, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes. Yes, may I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes, I wanted to comment on Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution. It's a show of black pride and respect, that they would rebel and to gain independence of Haiti. But then Toussaint Louverture was captured and then put into a cold cell, excuse me, in the French Alps. And, well, he was captured by deception, which is one of the tactics that they use. And then when he was corresponding with the leaders in France, I think he was talking to Napoleon Bonaparte, and that was probably the worst person he could have been talking to. But the guy deceived him. They captured him, and he died in exile. And whites in history had failed to note the importance of the Haitian Revolution, making the Louisiana Purchase possible. Empires were built. The French, Spaniards, Portuguese, and British built empires off of slave labor. And I think that's about it. I'll mute my line on that. Thanks for taking the call.
Other folks who dialed in with a hand up, feel free.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Good evening again, Thomas Smith, New York. Yeah, this was well, first I like to say, man, God bless the Haitian people, man. You talk about a show of black self-respect. That's what I'm talking about, man. God bless them. They paid for it deeply. But, you know, God bless them, though. You know, when they talk about French, and this is what confuses me, because I don't have France existing before 1792. It was a subsidy of the Holy Roman Empire before then, and I just don't see that you know, the history just doesn't make sense to me. I find France here before I find it in Europe in history, and just very strange. So I'm just trying to piece that together. But you know, I just really wanted to chime in and say, man, thank God for the Haitians, man. I mean, you talk about a show of black self-respect. I mean, to uprise and go through the night, pull out the knives, cut off the head. That's what I'm talking about. I'll mute my line for right now. Thank you.
Other folks who have comments, they wanted to make sure they got in. Line should be open.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I was actually trying to find the section that the sister brought up earlier in regards to them saying that there was only 10% of the slave revolt. 10% of there were only 10% of slave revolts during the slave trade, and that most of them were failures. I agree with her. That is just and you as well, Gus. That is just a way to demoralize us and make us think that our ancestors were accepting of this inhuman system, and that we didn't fight against it as much as we actually did. My studies show me way more evidence of us trying to violently revolt against being subjugated. There was a section here. Oh yeah, it's on page 45. It says, an ex-slave named Toussaint Louverture had wielded bands of rampaging rebels into an army that could defend their revolution from European powers who wanted to make it disappear. Between 1794 and 1799, his army defeated an invasion of tens of thousands of anti-revolutionary British redcoats, shining example of whites swarming like Voltron. So the British redcoats come to the defense of their French brothers to try and get rid of the niggers. So I thought that was a very interesting passage in regards to that particular situation. And then I thought this was an awesome example of black self-respect coming from Haiti, just to piggyback off of Thomas in New York. When he had said on page 47, he had said, although the country's history would be marked by massacre, civil war, dictatorship, and disaster, and although white nations have always found ways to exclude Haiti from the international community, Independent Haiti's first constitution created a radical new concept of citizenship. Only black people could be citizens of Haiti. And who is black? All who would say they rejected both France and slavery and would accept the fact that black folks ruled Haiti. Thus, even a white person could become a black, in quotes, citizen of Haiti as long as he or she rejected the assumption that whites should rule and Africans serve. I found that to be them practicing one of the highest forms of black self-respect in the sense of reorganizing society in a way that they saw as being a system of justice, with them being in control, not to dominate anyone else, including those whites that would relinquish their allegiance to France and slavery, but just putting themselves in a position of power where they could no longer be subjugated and misused. The only thing that I would look at and not really agree with was just even allowing white people in there. I believe that once you allow one white in there, they're going to infect a ton of people and create problems. But outside of that, I thought that was a great show of black self-respect. On page 48, there was a nice little example of white people's rhetorical ethics. On page 48, it says, thus, the bill's passage did not mean that Southern representatives who voted for it believed that slavery was wrong. As one of them insisted proudly, a large majority of people in the Southern states do not consider slavery as a crime. So again, it's just, they'll tell you one thing and do something else because their agenda is always white domination at all times. And we have to start focusing and understanding that, and that everything they do, even things that are seemingly positive, they have a sleight of hand at all times. And like the indigenous people in America used to say, white men speak with forked tongues. I see that the author played a little bit of word trickery. On page 49, he said Haitians had opened 1804 by announcing their grand experiment of a society whose basis for citizenship was literally the renunciation of white privilege. I've scratched that out in the book and replaced it with white supremacy. So again, they're playing the word game to try and confuse us as far as our understanding of them discussing the system of white supremacy in such an open fashion as far as providing this historical treatise, but also trying to confuse the issue by misusing words to misdirect our attention towards the true issue, which is racism and white supremacy. And then on page 50, it says here that Claiborne knew Thomas Jefferson quite well, but they were usually kept under wraps. This whole thing about Thomas Jefferson repeatedly coming up throughout this text as a serial rapist savage really lets us know that Thomas Jefferson was an animal and that his appetites had no bounds, obviously because he seems to be the most popular serial rapist discussed throughout this book. And it really just brings home the fact that that one of the integral parts of destroying our people, especially our psyche for liberation, comes from the systematic rape of our males, females, and children. And then there was a final section I wanted to discuss. It was on page 54. It says there was the legal problem of bringing slaves. Then again, there was the fact that a third of the refugees were free people of color, forbidden to immigrate to the United States, and unwanted by whites in New Orleans, particularly by English speakers who preferred the ostensible clarity of their own American pattern, in which all black people were assumed to be enslaved. This lets you know that the ultimate issue was the complete domination and subjugation of black people. That has always been their mode, their MO, modus operandi. That will always be their MO. Do not trust them, be suspicious of them. And I think that speaks volumes towards that sort of reality for us. And also, I couldn't find the page where they discussed the whole 10% of slave revolt, but in that section they also discussed about sharks eating, and it just brought home something that Dr. Ben told us back in the late 80s about the fact that there were so many slaves that were either thrown overboard or committed suicide en route from Africa to the Americas, that there was a white line, a stain of calcium from the bones of those slaves as they reached the bottom depths of the ocean after being eaten by sharks and other wildlife in the sea, that would stretch from the west coast of Africa all the way to the Caribbean, where the Canary Currents would carry the slave ships from the west coast of Africa to the Caribbean. That was just something that stood out to me in that same section about the whole 10% of slave revolt. So again, thank you very much for taking my call.
Right on. Anyone that we have not heard from after the second audio segment, anyone that we have not heard from, if you had comments you wanted to share, feel free.
Hello, get one in.
Your volume is very low, ma'am. If you could speak up, please.
Oh.
I'm turning the speaker off. Is that better?
That is better.
Speak up. I got my. Okay. Yeah. Talk about Voltron. When they said, I think the white people in Louisiana were gonna become more close or stick together more if they brought those enslaved people in. They felt that was a way for them to be more connected to other white people. So that put me in the mind of how we say on cows, how white people Voltron. Just around treating, black people bad. They'll team up with each other, and that'll bring them closer together as white people, as long as they can get together, whether they're from Yugoslavia or Bulgaria or wherever they are. They could be fighting amongst each other, but then they'll team up to get us down. And I took note of that. And yeah, long live Haiti. White people are still upset with Haiti to this day. They put the people of Haiti through so much, but long live Haiti. Good for Haiti. And those are the two observations I made. I'm gonna download my book here in a couple days. But thank you so much for letting me put my 2 cents in.
Glad to hear from you. Other folks that we have not heard from, if you have any comments you want to make sure you get in, feel free.
Well, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay. One of some things that stuck out to me, what was interesting, is when he started near the beginning of the segment talking about the roles, the Enlightenment philosophies, how they emphasize, black inferiority. There's no way slaves could defeat their masters or enslavers, and how they can't shape the modern world. It would be shaped by whites. And I see a lot of this today, analogously, in apocalyptic and sci-fi movies, when you see the absence of non-white people, that they literally see the future as non-white people being non-existent or being destroyed in whatever the apocalyptic event is. So that kind of stood out to me. And the second thing one thing I found problematic was when he sort of threw in there, when describing the different slave traders in Louisiana at the time, not all slave traders were white. Like, that's true, obviously, empirically. Like, you've had overseers and stuff that were black, sometimes multiracial, but he doesn't really elaborate on what's the significance that they were not all of them were white. Like, so what? That's sort of what it left me asking. And the quote-unquote Voltron Act by the Europeans, I think inadvertently, looking at today, I think it highlights the importance, I think, of what folks like Delaney and Garvey were arguing, and other Pan-African individuals. I think it suggests that one of the ways that we have to counteract white supremacy is, in fact, global black unity, because I don't think you can because I think that's what one of the major problems with Haiti, is that it was really a 5-on-1, basically, when I look at it. Those are just my thoughts. I'm done.
Any folks that we have not heard from during the second segment, after the second audio, any folks that we have not heard from yet? Assuming we got everybody who had something to share in the second audio segment. I will get in my quick comments, and then if anybody had anything else they wanted to add, any additional comments or questions, we should have time for that as well. Some of the things that stood out immediately, and this kind of goes to one of the points that I made both this week and last week. For me, this is on page 132, where he says minor slave rebellions were one thing, total African victory was another thing entirely. It was so incomprehensible, in fact, that European thinkers who couldn't stop talking about the revolution in France clammed up about Saint-Domingue. I think that is significant because it's the same pattern that I suggest extends right up to today, 2015, in terms of this deliberate effort to hide, obscure black revolts and counter-violence attempts that black people have made worldwide and on into present day to combat racism, white supremacy, that this is done deliberately on the part of white people. They have no problem playing up any acts of white violence, and I would even say contrasted by how frequently you hear white people talk about John Brown. They have no problem talking about this white man going and killing other white people, hacking up white people in front of their families, even in Kansas before he got to Harper's Ferry in Virginia. But they have no problem talking about that, but talking about black counterviolence to eradicate racism, white supremacy, no, we're not going to deal with that at all. And just the significance of the Louisiana Purchase being completely divorced, even present day, 2015, from the Haitian Revolution and black people showing black self-respect to end enslavement in Haiti. I think that's a deliberate act of racism, white supremacy, in my opinion. As I said, current day, continuing. Let's see. Yeah, where he says, I think several people touched on where it's white people continue to punish black people in the area of the world known as Haiti, where they are continually excluded, abused, mistreated. I think that just, again, shows the global white dedication, where, again, they're not ignorant, they understand, and they have a historical understanding that we're supposed to make these niggas pay forever. I've heard Mr. Fuller say we're going to make an example of these niggas to show what happens if you ever attempt to rise up against us. It'll be punishment permanently forever, where you'll be in squalor and starving and just anything that we can possibly do to have you suffer and have your grandchildren and great-grandchildren have them suffer for anything that you do to oppose or disrupt our system of domination. I think Roz already pointed out where, for me, this is on page 140, we have some white people who are voting against slavery, or at least voting against the importation of black people from different parts of the world. That does not mean that they are for black people, not at all. And I think a lot of times we get confused about that, where sometimes white people disagree about how racism, white supremacy should be practiced. That does not mean they're against it. It just means that they have a different perspective, a different scheme as to how black people should be abused and managed. Let's see. I thought that was very important, the use of the term white privilege, and even more so because in the sentence where he says Haitians had opened 1804 by announcing their grand experiment of a society whose basis for citizenship was literally the renunciation of white privilege, is that if you continue in that paragraph, he goes on to say the great continent would incubate a second slavery exponentially greater in economic power than the first. That would be a much more accurate term, much more accurate P word, if you will. White power, renunciation of white power. White supremacy would be great, much more accurate. White terrorism, any of these other words, just for me, it strongly reinforced the word white privilege should never be used. It is simply inaccurate. I think white people, they understand, they are consciously aware that it obfuscates, that it really dilutes what we're talking about, which is what it means to be white, and global white commitment to maintaining racism, white supremacy, white power worldwide. Let's see what else. Yeah, I already touched on that. He says American women and a few men complained that here, he's talking about in the New Orleans territory, wealthy white men sometimes lived with mulatto women until it came time to marry a respectable white one. I thought that was significant, just again showing it is an entrenched aspect of white culture, white supremacy culture, the rape and sexual exploitation of black people. That is one of the have-tos. You can just expect that. Generational damage that's done as a result of this, and the fact that they understand I can have my fun. I can go around raping black females, black males, black children. I can have my fun doing this, but still got to go about the business of making sure that we have the next generation of racists, which means that I got to go and, get me a white woman, at least for show, and have a few children, and then I can go back to raping all the black females, black males, black children that I want. But, we'll stop that for maybe 5 minutes and go get my white woman. We'll do our child thing, and then we can, each go back to doing our separate raping. Moving forward. Oh, yeah. Where he says, Claiborne, I guess he's the governor of the New Orleans, Louisiana territory when they get it. Let's see, where he says, when Claiborne arrived in 1804, bringing the news that Congress would probably block the international slave trade to the territory, he discovered an almost universal sentiment in favor of this inhuman traffic. Hugely important. And again, and that's why I think when we had Gwen Ragsdale on the program at the beginning of the week, I said that for me, it was disturbing and a problem to start a book where you have one of the main characters is this white woman, Miss Blue Eyes, where she and her husband are abolitionists and they are against slavery and trying to liberate black people, because it's just not representative of what it means to be white, to be playing up these John Browns and Jane Browns as though, yes, you had a lot of white people who were against slavery and they were for the niggers. That is simply inaccurate. And we do a disservice, in my opinion, when we discuss racism, white supremacy, by presenting it as though you've got a lot of these Tim Wises and Jane Browns and John Browns, Jane Elliott's, as though we've got a lot of quote-unquote white allies. That is simply not the case, as an almost universal sentiment in favor of this inhumane traffic, the abuse, torture of black people. Let's see, moving forward. Oh, yeah, I thought that was great, where one of the problems that they had, this importation of black people from Cuba or Haiti, that a lot of them were quote-unquote free, and it was just assumed amongst white people, he says English-speaking white people, that it's just supposed to be taken for granted. If you're black, you are enslaved. You're a slave. We can do whatever you want, and you see that obviously playing out 2015. I don't think anything has changed. Let's see. Oh, man, this was hugely important paragraph where he says, more trade, this for me is on 153, more trade, more connections with other markets, and this was implied, more unity between white citizens, whatever their native language, allowing slavery's expansion. The mayor and other wealthy Louisianans insisted made white New Orleans and white America more prosperous and more united, binding states and factions together. That right there is hugely important, and we've heard that theme repeated, I think, both weeks now. That's been consistent, that this can be something that we coalesce around as a nation, as a global white network. It would be better for us. This will mash factions and disagreements between each other, and we will prosper and grow stronger together if we can just get on the same page about how we're going to manage, dominate, and abuse niggers. Hugely important, and a theme that is repeated. I suspect that's going to be repeated for the duration of the book, and that's when, in my opinion, that should be played up when people talk about this book, or I won't even say played up, it should be amplified. We should take note of that, because I think you see that consistently as well. White people coalesce. They can get on the same page, stop arguing with each other, and focus on who they should be abusing, the niggers, us, non-white people. Hugely important as well in this whole discussion about how they're going to deal with the newly acquired territory in Louisiana, where it says the governor himself enforced only a single law. Following territorial regulations to the letter, he expelled all free males of color over the age of 15 who entered on the refugee ships. Women and children could stay. It reminded me immediately when Gwen Ragsdale was on the program, and she talked about when you have this culture of raping black people, one of the important things is to make sure that you separate and totally destroy black masculinity, black femininity. You divide males and females. She said you get rid of the black male first. And it seems like this is consistent with exactly what she said during the broadcast. Let's get rid of the male niggers, send them, wherever they're going to go, but you're not going to stay here, so that we greatly reduce the threat of having these black males become sullen and angry and decide that they want to do something about this war being waged against the black people. We'll just dump them somewhere else, but they can't stay here, and we can take care of the females and children, no problem. We can take care of them. We'll rape them, abuse them, whatever else we want to do with them. But I thought that was hugely important as well. That's footnoted if folks want to check out more details about that. Where he says a few miles closer to the city, talking about this is in New Orleans, a few miles closer to the city was a huge labor camp that still survives as the Show Plantation Ormond. I was reminded Gary Riblin when he was on the program. He wrote Katrina after the flood when he said he was covering Hurricane Katrina down in New Orleans, that he stayed on a slave plantation while he would go into New Orleans and recover, and then he would go back, and that was his lodging back in 2005, 2006, and even earlier this year, where they've got some slave plantation in New Orleans that they've opened up where white people can go and hang out and visit and check out the silverware and linens and tablecloths that they used from this period of time. I think those are most of the main notes that I picked out from this segment. Folks have anything else that they wanted to make sure they got in before we wrap up? Anything else?
I just want to say one last thing concerning Jefferson putting a ban around 1807 on the slave trade, and then doing that at the time when slaves had increased greatly, about, I guess, 20,000 in, a few years. So he figured that they could breed slaves from within, and he could contribute himself with his female slaves, and any slaves born to any children born to a slave then would be slaves. So he wasn't really trying to do any favors on the slave ban, because at the same time he was expanding it and also contributing to the production of more slaves. I'll mute my line.
For sure. Any other comments? Folks want to make sure they get in before we wrap up this week? Everyone satisfied?
Somebody.
Go ahead, ma'am.
I'm sorry about that. I apologize if you can't hear me. I'm going to speak up. I think somebody already brought this up. They always go into the fact of how the white enslavers, they raped the women, and they did a lot of that. But they never want to talk about how they violated those enslaved men and the children. They won't talk to you about that. They won't tell you about it, but we know that it happened.
Anything else folks want to make sure they get in before we wrap things up?
There was a section on page 29 where they said, or I think this is the actual hard copy book. I know you're looking at it, so you're using a different version. It says slavery's expansion was one top. It says, hold on, let me find my spot. They did so because of interest. Slavery's expansion was one topic in which political leaders from all sides could find a common interest. So I think that line is really important simply because it really lets you know that racism, white supremacy is infecting all 10 areas of people activity, and that no matter what these white so-called political leaders disagree about, they can all agree on the domination and subjugation of black people at all times. That is something that started at the origin of this country. It is happening right now, and we really need to start looking at white people for what they really are. And we should really take a page out of their book. The same way they formed those Voltron to subjugate us, we need to form a Voltron to defend ourselves. They've done such an effective job of separating us and making us look at each other as strangers, and then, of course, endearing ourselves to them. It's really a sad state of affairs how these tactics have worked for so long, and we haven't figured out a way to really fight against it, except for like there's a black male who was speaking earlier, who just talked about a Pan-African approach. I truly believe that the same thing. I think that any black person who has a Pan-African understanding of the way the world should work, as far as amongst black, non-white black people in particular, I think they have the greatest idea, simply because all of our leaders, no matter what era of our history in this hemisphere, have all spoken to the same thing. And if you look at white people, they have had a pan-European agenda. And like the sister was saying earlier, no matter what they're fighting about, when there's a black person around, they will drop that fight in an instant and coalesce around destroying that black person that's in their midst. And we need to start looking at that for what it is, and also start mirroring that. Take a page out of their book, and maybe if we start to, react in that holistic way as well, the way that they react towards us, we can maybe make some headway. But it all starts with the change of our mentality first. And really, we have to educate ourselves about our enemy, really understand racism, white supremacy, what it is and how it works. And then from there, I think it will start to push us in the direction of understanding that we are the only friends we have. And until we come to that realization and understanding worldwide as a people, we are going to be in dire straits for a long time to come. Thank you.
We have about 30 seconds. If anybody else had something they wanted to get in quickly.
Yeah, real quick. I just wanted to say, man, I wonder, because it was a part where the New Orleans had the slaves coming in from other places. And I wonder if that had to play in with Katrina, these people are refugees. They don't really belong here. I mean, knowing that they hate all black people, but, just thinking that. And also in Haiti, with the earthquake, just to know that the earthquake causing machine is under France called CERN. And they could cause an earthquake with that machine. And I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't hit them with that earthquake. And that was all I had to say. Thank you. This book is really good, and I'm glad that we're reading it.
Right on. Before we wrap up, I just want to go back to that quote because I did think it was very important. My reading from this passage, this was right at the end of chapter 1. As I said, this is not, I don't think, an indictment of black people, of African agricultural practices. This is an indictment on white people and what they were doing in Europe, lack of information that they had, agriculturally speaking, where he says most Europeans were only one bad season from starvation. They all grew food by local traditions of agriculture that in technological complexity, efficiency, and productivity were closer to the year 0 than to 1900. And some folks thought that was not accurate and that he was making some sort of commentary or scrutinizing what was happening on the continent. Do folks want to reassess that, or am I misreading this?
I know that I spoke about that, but I spoke about it in the same terms that you did. I actually said that was one of their main reasons for kidnapping Africans was because they knew of our history of basically we created the whole concept of agriculture, and we had tons of experience for tens of thousands of years going as far as our ability to grow massive amounts of crops for our people, whether it's the Nile Valley stretching all the way to West Africa. So I felt like you that was highly inaccurate. And also, even if you look at some of the other groups, whether it was the indigenous Americans in North America.
What's inaccurate? When you say that it was highly inaccurate, what's highly inaccurate?
Oh, well, the way I was agreeing with you in the sense that the way that they were writing it, it was like they were lumping white people and black people all in the same boat. Whereas they were specifically speaking about Europeans, not us. In other words, African people, they knew what they were getting by kidnapping Africans, were a workforce that had the most experience as far as agriculture. And if you look at white history, the only way that they were able to survive anywhere they landed was with the agricultural techniques of the indigenous people they encountered, whether that was North America, or if you go to Central America with the Mayans and the Aztecs. These people had some of the most sophisticated agricultural techniques that have ever been utilized in most cases. So as a result, these Europeans knew to subjugate those people, they would be able to feed themselves on a massive scale because they came from such families. So, yeah, maybe I wasn't clear with that. But, yeah, I agree with you emphatically, and that was my position. But I don't know if I was not clear about that, so I do apologize.
Okay. Yeah, no apology. I just wanted to get that clear. My interpretation was that it was not lumping white people in with everybody else. It seemed to me that it was pretty specific in terms of talking specifically about Europeans. In fact, he says Europeans were only one bad season from starvation. To me, that seems pretty clear that he's not talking about everybody. He's just talking about white folks on this one and their agricultural ineptitude. But folks can check it out. It's for me, it's kind of the close of chapter 1. That's make sure I'm giving out the accurate. Actually, it's the beginning of chapter 2, very early in chapter 2 for me, and that should hold even if the page numbers are off. Just go kind of early portion of chapter 2 to look for that segment. Just, folks can come to their own interpretation, what they think about that segment. I
think that statement's true today, too. I think that if they can't go and leave Europe and pillage other places, they'll be a year away from starvation again.
Right on. We will leave it there. We will be back tomorrow. Compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. We'll be able to review news, observations, workplace racism from the past 7 days. Be looking forward to hearing commentary from folks who have anything that they would like to touch on. We also will be here on Sunday. It's our global Sunday talk on racism, white supremacy. Hopefully we'll have good participation from some of our listeners who are outside the states and folks who are right here as well. But that's Sunday early, 12 noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. We'll be here. Looking forward to hearing from folks then. We should also be here on Monday. The documentary film Wilmington on Fire. Mr. Chris Everett, black male filmmaker, should be here talking about an incident of white terrorism, coordinated white terrorism in Wilmington, North Carolina. We had the audio segment from, I think, 2 weeks back that we heard. Folks had a lot of commentary around that, but that'll be Monday, normal broadcast time, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. If you have any commentary, I know folks who are listening to the archive of our book study session, if you want to write in your comments and then we can share them the following week, feel free, untiljustice@gmail.com. I'll read them on the program as we go. We should be on this book, I think, for at least 8-9 more sessions. I submit that I think the author, the narrator, is rolling pretty fast. I think it's a white person reading this book. In my view, he is going pretty quickly and getting through. So this book is a little longer, but with the pace that he's going and with the amount of material that we're covering per week, I don't think we're going to be on this book as long as I thought. I think we should have at least 8-9 more of these to go, but I'm enjoying the read, good information, and also being alert because this is a white author, a racist suspect, so should definitely be on account for that as well. Thanks for all the folks for chiming in, sharing. Great to hear feedback on the book, and hopefully it will continue as we roll along. I will encourage folks, I know it is quote-unquote holiday season, remain codified. Sobriety would be best under conditions of war. I would definitely assert if you're going to be in the vehicle, number one, buckle up. Let's do everything we can to minimize contact with enforcement officers. And number two, you do not want to be under the influence. If you're the driver, passenger, even the pedestrian, you really do not want to make it easy for the Daniel Holtzclaws of the world to ruin your life and cause you all of these difficulties. Let's do everything we can to minimize that. You really want to be in your right mind so that you can make the best possible decisions to protect yourself and other black people, other non-white people that you might be responsible for. We whites are waging war against us, and our behavior should reflect that at all times. We cannot afford to be slipping and pretending as though everything is cool when it is most certainly not. That said, invest if you think the program is constructive. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Listener-supported, counter-racist radio. When you visit the blog, PayPal button is in the top right corner. If you're not into PayPal, drop us an email and we will get you a physical mailing address. Huge thanks to all the folks who have invested down through the years. I hope the program has been and continues to be worthy of your time and energy. Definitely wanted to make sure I got in before we wrapped up. I think Clarence Thomas, in his autobiography, I think he wrote saying, because he was also a Georgia native, and saying that Georgia was not a good place to be for black people at the time when he was growing up. And I have said consistently, I don't know when Georgia has been good for black people. You could probably replace that with any state, but I think that would be true for Georgia forever, and this book just further confirms that. At any rate, thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back in about 24 hours. Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people, victims of racism. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice as soon as possible. Context of White Supremacy signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed.
I'm a victim,
No
brother.
problem. You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
Even my conditioning has been conditioned.